This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. We had only moved in a couple weeks earlier. My parents were so excited about finally buying a place of our own after years of renting. I was 17 at the time, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about having to switch schools for my senior year. But I tried to keep an open mind as we toured the house with the elderly owner who was selling it. There was something off about him, though. At first, he seemed friendly enough, smiling and pointing out all the home's features. But at one point, when my parents were distracted looking at the kitchen, I caught him staring at me with this look. It's hard to describe, but his whole demeanor changed for a split second. His eyes went cold, and his mouth twisted into this creepy grin. It sent chills down my spine. But as quickly as it happened, his normal pleasant expression returned. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. Anyway, fast forward to that Sunday morning. My parents had gone out early to run some errands and do some shopping for the new place. I was enjoying having the house to myself, lounging in my pajamas and scrolling through my phone. Around 10 a.m., I started hearing some strange noises coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling or something. You know how older homes can be creaky. But then I distinctly heard what sounded like footsteps. My heart started racing. I called out, "Hello?" thinking maybe my parents had come home early. No response. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. The footsteps had stopped. After a minute of silence, I was about to go back to my room when suddenly there was a loud bang from outside, like someone had slammed into the side of the house. I jumped and let out a yelp. Panicking now, I ran back to my bedroom and locked the door. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called my mom. No answer. I texted her, "Someone's in the house, come home now." Then I dialed 911. As I was talking to the dispatcher, my blood ran cold as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Oh God, this was really happening. I told the dispatcher in a trembling whisper that I could hear someone approaching. She assured me officers were on the way and told me to stay quiet and hidden. I wedged myself between my bed and the wall, clutching a baseball bat I thankfully had in my room. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and started coming down the hallway towards my room. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. Then the doorknob started to rattle as someone tried to open it. Thank God I had locked it. "Please go away, please go away," I silently pleaded. There was a long pause. Then I heard breathing, deep, raspy breathing, right on the other side of the door. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, mercifully, I heard the footsteps start to move away. They went back down the hallway and descended the stairs. I stayed frozen in place, straining my ears for any sound. A few minutes later, I heard sirens approaching. I've never been so relieved in my life. When the police arrived, I was still huddled in my room, too terrified to come out until they cleared the house. They searched every inch of the place but found no sign of an intruder. No broken windows, no forced entry. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But then one of the officers pointed out something chilling. There were muddy footprints in the upstairs hallway. My mom had just vacuumed the carpet the day before, so they were fresh. But here's the really freaky part. The prints were huge, way bigger than a normal shoe size, and they stopped abruptly right in front of my bedroom door. The police took the whole thing very seriously. They dusted for fingerprints and took photos of the footprints. But ultimately, They couldn't find any other evidence. They increased patrols in our neighborhood for the next few weeks. My parents were freaked out, of course. We immediately installed a security system and extra locks. For a while, they wouldn't let me stay home alone. But eventually, things settled back into a normal routine. Except, I never felt safe in that house again. I always felt like I was being watched. Sometimes at night I'd wake up to those same heavy footsteps, only to find the hallway empty. The uneasy feeling never went away. I moved out as soon as I graduated high school. My parents eventually sold the place a couple years later. They said it just never felt like home. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. Was it a burglar who got spooked and ran off? Some kind of paranormal entity? I honestly don't know. All I know is, I'll never forget the sheer terror of hearing those footsteps approaching my door and that raspy breathing on the other side. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it. I'm just grateful whatever it was didn't manage to get inside my room that day. I don't want to imagine what might have happened if it had. In early 1997, we found what seemed like the perfect place, an old farmhouse in rural Missouri, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods. The price was a steal, probably because it needed some work. The elderly couple who owned it were selling because the husband had passed away after a long illness, and his widow couldn't manage the property alone. We were thrilled when our offer was accepted. After so many years of transient living, we finally had a real home to call our own. We took a few weeks off work to oversee the move-in and start on some renovations. That's when things started getting weird. It began with little things. I'd turn on a lamp, leave the room for a minute, and come back to find it off. At first I figured it was just faulty wiring in an old house, but it kept happening, even after Jake replaced all the electrical. Then doors started mysteriously locking or unlocking on their own. I'd go to open a door I knew I'd left unlocked, only to find it wouldn't budge. Or I'd come across a door standing wide open that I was certain I'd locked before bed. Our dogs seemed on edge from the moment we moved in. They'd stare intently at empty corners of rooms, growling at nothing we could see. Twice we came home to find them loose in the house when we were positive we'd locked them in the mudroom before leaving. I tried to rationalize it all away. Old house settling, forgetful minds after years on the road, that sort of thing. But deep down, a creeping sense of unease was taking hold. Things escalated about a week into our stay. I was in the kitchen unpacking boxes when I heard Jake yell from upstairs. I ran up to find him standing in the hallway, white as a sheet. "I couldn't open the bedroom door," he said shakily. It was like something was holding it shut from the other side. I could feel the resistance when I tried to turn the knob. Then suddenly it just gave way. I peeked into the bedroom, half expecting to see someone hiding in there. But it was empty, the window still locked from the inside. That night, we were jolted awake by a piercing alarm. We scrambled out of bed in a panic, thinking it was the smoke detector. But as we ran through the house, we realized it wasn't coming from any of our alarms. The sound seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves, filling every room with its shrill cry. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We stood there in the dark, hearts racing, straining to hear. But there was only silence. The next morning, we did a thorough search of the house and property. We couldn't find any alarm system, hidden speakers, nothing that could explain what we'd heard. I was seriously rattled by this point. I suggested we stay at a motel for a few nights until we could figure things out. But Jake was stubborn. He'd sunk all our savings into this place and wasn't about to be chased out by some electrical glitches and old pipes, as he put it. So we stayed, and things only got stranger. Objects would disappear, only to turn up days later in bizarre places, like finding my hairbrush in the attic when I knew I'd left it on the bathroom sink. We'd hear footsteps overhead when we were both downstairs. Sometimes at night, I'd wake to the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, but when I turned on the light, no one was there. The worst was the whispering. It started as a faint murmur, barely audible. I thought it was just the wind at first, but it grew louder over time until I could almost make out words. It seemed to follow me from room to room, always just over my shoulder. Jake heard it too, though he tried to play it off. I could see the fear in his eyes, even as he assured me it was just our imagination running wild in a new place. About 2 weeks in, things came to a head. I was in the basement doing laundry when the light suddenly went out. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but it was dead, even though I knew it had been fully charged. In the pitch black, I heard something moving, slow, dragging footsteps coming down the stairs. I called out, thinking it was Jake, but got no response. The steps kept coming closer in the darkness. I backed up against the wall, heart pounding out of my chest. Just as I felt a cold breath on my face, the lights snapped back on. I was alone in the basement. I ran upstairs, screaming for Jake. He came running from the backyard where he'd been mowing. He swore he hadn't been in the house, hadn't heard anything. That was it for me. I told Jake we were leaving now. He started to argue, but one look at my face, and he knew I meant business. We threw some clothes in a bag and hightailed it out of there, dogs in tow. We drove straight through to California, where Jake's sister lives. We've been crashing with her while trying to figure out what to do. Jake wants to go back, convinced there must be a rational explanation for everything. He's worried about losing the house if we default on the mortgage. But I can't shake the feeling that something in that house doesn't want us there. Something angry, something that's been there a long time. I have nightmares about those footsteps in the dark, that whispering voice. I don't know what to do. We sank everything we had into that place. But how can we live somewhere that feels so wrong? I can't explain what happened in any logical way. All I know is that I've never been so terrified in my life, and I never want to set foot in that house again. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Am I crazy for feeling this way? I'm at my wit's end and could really use some advice. Thanks for listening to my story. It all started when Mom decided we needed a fresh start after Dad left. She found this old house in a quiet neighborhood in New York, mostly populated by elderly folks. The previous owners were an older couple who had decided to move to a retirement community in Florida. At first, we were excited about the change. The house was spacious, with a big backyard, and the price was surprisingly affordable for New York. My brother Jake and I helped Mom move our stuff in, and for the first few days, everything seemed normal. We were busy unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting settled in our new rooms. But then, about a week after we moved in, the strange occurrences began. It started with footsteps. I was in my room one night trying to fall asleep when I heard distinct footsteps coming from Mom's room above me. I thought maybe she was having trouble sleeping and was pacing, but when I asked her about it the next morning, she said she'd slept through the night without getting up once. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd dreamed it. But then it happened again and again, always at night, always in Mom's room. Sometimes it would go on for hours, other times just for a few minutes. I started losing sleep, lying awake and listening to those phantom footsteps, my heart racing every time they started up. Jake said he heard them too, but Mom kept insisting she never noticed anything. I could tell she was getting worried about us, probably thinking the stress of the move was getting to us, but we knew what we heard. Then came Thanksgiving. We decided to host dinner at our new place, inviting some of our relatives who lived nearby. I was in the kitchen, carrying a heavy dish of mashed potatoes to the dining room, when I heard it. A woman's voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. "Be careful, dear. You'll hurt yourself." I nearly dropped the dish in shock. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't Mom's or any of our relatives. It was older, softer, with a hint of concern. I stood there, frozen, until Mom called out asking if I needed help. I didn't tell anyone about the voice that day. I didn't want to ruin Thanksgiving or make everyone think I was losing it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was that woman? Why did she warn me? The next incident happened a few days later. I was home alone after school, working on homework in my room, when I heard it. Crying. Soft, muffled sobs coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it might be coming from outside, maybe a neighbor or something, but as I listened, I realized it was definitely inside our house. I got up, my hands shaking, and slowly walked out into the hallway. The crying got louder as I approached Mom's room. I stood outside her door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sobs were coming from inside, but I knew Mom was at work. I don't know where I found the courage, but I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The crying stopped the moment I stepped inside. I checked everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. Nothing. But the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. I ran out of there and didn't go back in until Mom came home. When I told Mom about the crying, she got this strange look on her face. She sat me down and suggested that maybe it was Grandma trying to communicate with us. Grandma had passed away just a month before we moved, and Mom thought perhaps her spirit had followed us to the new house. But I knew it wasn't Grandma. The voice I heard on Thanksgiving, the crying, it didn't sound like her at all. Grandma had a loud, boisterous laugh and a strong personality. This presence felt different, softer, sadder somehow. Things escalated from there. Objects would move on their own, keys disappearing from where we left them only to turn up in weird places, pictures falling off walls for no reason. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find all my dresser drawers open, clothes spilling out onto the floor. Jake started having nightmares. He'd wake up screaming about an old woman standing at the foot of his bed, just watching him. Mom was at her wit's end, torn between believing us and trying to find logical explanations for everything. The final straw came about 2 months after we moved in. It was a Saturday night, and we were all home. We'd just finished watching a movie in the living room when the lights started flickering. At first, we thought it was just a power surge, but then they went out completely. In the darkness, we heard it, that same soft, elderly woman's voice I'd heard on Thanksgiving. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It filled the room, sounding like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You need to leave," it said. "It's not safe here. Please, go now." We all heard it. There was no denying it this time. Mom grabbed our hands and pulled us towards the door. We ran out of the house in our pajamas, not even stopping to grab shoes or jackets. We spent that night in a hotel, and Mom started looking for a new place the very next day. We never went back to that house except to grab our essential belongings, and even then, we went in groups, never alone. To this day, we don't know what was in that house. Was it the spirit of the previous owner? Some other entity? We never found out. The new owners haven't reported any issues, which makes it even more baffling. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined it all, if the stress of the move and losing Grandma just got to us. But then I remember that voice, the footsteps, the crying, and I know it was real. Whatever was in that house, it wanted us out, and it got its wish. I still have trouble sleeping some nights, half expecting to hear those phantom footsteps again. But mostly, I'm just grateful we got out when we did. Who knows what might have happened if we'd stayed? I was 12 years old at the time, living with my family in a quiet suburb of Wichita, Kansas. Our house was your typical suburban home. 2 stories, white picket fence, the works. Nothing special or remarkable about it. We had 2 dogs, Max and Buddy, who were usually pretty good watchdogs and would bark at any little noise. That Friday night, my parents had decided to go out for a date night. They didn't get to do it often, so I was happy for them. Plus, it meant I got the house to myself for a few hours. As a 12-year-old boy, that was pretty exciting. I had plans to play video games all night and eat junk food. Everything started out normal enough. My parents left around 7 p.m., reminding me to keep the doors locked and not to stay up too late. I immediately fired up my PlayStation and settled in for a marathon gaming session. Max and Buddy were lounging nearby, occasionally getting up to beg for chips or popcorn. I lost track of time as I played, totally immersed in my game. It must have been close to 9 p.m. when it happened. I had just completed a difficult level and was taking a break to grab more snacks from the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I heard it, clear as day, the unmistakable sound of our front door opening and then closing. I froze in my tracks, my heart suddenly pounding. At first, I thought it must be my parents coming home early, but then I realized they would have called out to let me know they were back. And the dogs. Why weren't Max and Buddy barking? They always went crazy when someone came to the door. Panic started to set in as I stood there in the dark hallway. Someone was in the house. A burglar, a kidnapper. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. I was just a kid. What was I supposed to do? Trying to stay calm, I tiptoed back to my room as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered frantically that I thought someone had broken into our house. She told me to stay calm and that police were on the way. After I hung up, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to my bed. If whoever was in the house came upstairs, I wanted to be ready to defend myself. I stood there in the dark, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white, straining my ears for any sound of footsteps. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. I kept expecting to hear someone creeping up the stairs or moving around downstairs. But there was nothing, just eerie silence. Even the dogs were quiet, which made no sense. Where were they? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me as they got closer. Soon I could see flashing lights outside my window. I heard car doors slamming and voices calling out, "Police! Is anyone home?" I almost cried with relief as I ran downstairs, still clutching my bat. 2 officers were standing in the doorway, flashlights sweeping across the room. "I'm here," I called out. "I'm the one who called." The officers came in and started checking the house room by room. I followed behind them, my legs shaky. To my shock, we found Max and Buddy curled up asleep in the laundry room. They barely lifted their heads as we came in. After thoroughly searching every room, closet, and possible hiding spot, the officers found no sign of an intruder. All the doors and windows were still locked. There was no evidence anyone had broken in. I was confused and frustrated. I knew what I had heard. Someone had definitely opened and closed that front door. I wasn't imagining things. The officers were kind, but I could tell they were skeptical. They probably thought I was just a kid with an overactive imagination who got spooked being home alone. Just as they were getting ready to leave, my parents pulled into the driveway. They rushed inside, looking worried and confused by all the police cars. The officers explained the situation, while I stood there feeling embarrassed and still shaken up. That's when one of the officers mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, there had been a string of break-ins in our area recently. The culprits would scout out houses, watching for when families left, then slip inside to rob the place. But in those cases, they usually go in and out quickly, the officer explained. They'll open the door, step inside to look around, then leave right away if they hear or see anyone inside. It's possible that's what happened here. Someone opened the door, realized the house wasn't empty, and left immediately. It made sense, I guess, except for one major detail that I pointed out. But I only heard the door open and close once, I insisted. If someone came in and then left right away, wouldn't I have heard it open and close twice? The officers exchanged glances but didn't have an answer for that. They took some notes, told us to call if anything else happened, and left. My parents tried to comfort me, saying I had done the right thing by calling 911. They even let me sleep in their room that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In the days and weeks that followed, I kept replaying that night in my head. The sound of the door, the silence of the dogs, the fact that I only heard it open once. It's been years now, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe there really was an intruder who somehow got out without me hearing. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that to this day, I still get chills when I hear a door open unexpectedly, and I always double-check that it closes behind me. It started around 11 p.m. I was settling in at my desk with a cup of coffee, ready to tackle some client reports, when my cell phone rang. Unknown number. I ignored it, figuring it was a wrong number or spam call. But then it rang again, and again. After the fifth call in 15 minutes, I was getting annoyed. I finally answered, but there was just silence on the other end before they hung up. The calls kept coming, sometimes with long pauses in between, sometimes rapid fire one after another. I tried blocking the number, but they seemed to be calling from different lines each time. By midnight, I was seriously on edge. Who would be so persistent in trying to reach me at this hour? And why weren't they saying anything? I tried to focus on my work, but I kept glancing nervously at my phone. The office felt unnaturally quiet and empty. Every little sound made me jump, the hum of the air conditioning kicking on, a car passing on the street outside. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just some glitch or prank caller, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 1 a.m. I heard it, the distinctive electronic beep of someone swiping a keycard at the building's main entrance. My heart started racing. No one else was supposed to be here tonight. I held my breath, straining to listen. Footsteps echoed from the lobby downstairs, slow and deliberate. I was on the second floor, and for a moment I debated what to do. Maybe it was just the cleaning crew coming in early. But no. They always announced themselves, and besides, they weren't scheduled until 5 a.m. The footsteps were getting closer to the stairwell now. Panic rising in my throat, I quickly turned off my desk lamp and computer monitor, plunging my area into darkness. I ducked down behind my desk, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. The stairwell door creaked open. More footsteps coming up the stairs now. Slow, methodical, as if they were trying not to make noise. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, desperately trying to dial 911 without making a sound. But in my panicked state, I accidentally hit the home button, lighting up the screen. I quickly muffled it against my chest, praying whoever was out there hadn't seen the brief flash of light. The footsteps had stopped. There was just silence now, heavy and oppressive. I could hear my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. Were they still there? Had they seen me? What did they want? After what felt like an eternity, I heard movement again. But this time, it was coming from right outside my cubicle. Oh God, they were here, on this floor, mere feet away from me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. A shadow fell across the opening of my cubicle. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of metal against fabric, like someone unsheathing a blade. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I leapt up and bolted for the emergency exit at the far end of the office, knocking over my chair in the process. I heard a shout behind me and pounding footsteps giving chase. I slammed through the exit door and flew down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my legs pumping furiously. I burst out of the building into the cool night air, gasping for breath. Without looking back, I sprinted down the empty street, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the office as possible. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I ducked into an all-night diner, collapsing into a booth. With trembling hands, I managed to call 911. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them a statement describing the break-in and chase. They went to investigate the office while I waited at the diner, jumping at every sound and movement. When the officers returned, what they told me chilled me to the bone. They had found no sign of forced entry. Whoever it was had used a valid keycard to access the building. Security camera footage showed a man entering shortly after 1 a.m., matching the timing I'd described. But here's the truly terrifying part. After coming up the stairs to my floor, he had just stood there, completely motionless, for nearly 10 minutes, as if he was listening, waiting. The officers said if I hadn't run when I did, who knows what might have happened. They also found a large hunting knife dropped in the stairwell, likely discarded during the chase. The implications of that discovery made me feel sick. This wasn't just some random break-in. Whoever this was, they had come prepared and with clear intent to do harm. In the days that followed, as the police investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. The keycard used to access the building belonged to a co-worker who swore they hadn't lost it. And perhaps most chilling of all, when they traced those persistent phone calls I'd been receiving, they all came from inside the building. It's been months now, and they still haven't caught the guy. I've since quit that job and moved to a new city, but I still have nightmares about that night. The sound of footsteps on stairs makes my heart race. I'm jumpy around strangers and always looking over my shoulder. Sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't run? What if I'd stayed hidden? Would he have eventually left, or would he have kept searching until he found me? And why me? Was I specifically targeted, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that my sense of safety, of normalcy, was shattered that night. I'm sharing this as a warning. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And please be careful out there. You never know who might be watching, waiting for their chance to strike. As I drove further away from the city lights, the roads got darker and narrower. I found myself on a bumpy gravel road surrounded by dense forest on both sides. My headlights barely illuminated the path ahead as trees loomed ominously overhead. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me, but I pushed it aside. I was just being paranoid, right? After what felt like an eternity of driving deeper into the wilderness, my GPS indicated I had arrived at the delivery address. I slowed to a stop and peered out the window, but all I could see was pitch blackness. There were no houses, no lights, nothing but trees as far as the eye could see. This can't be right, I muttered to myself. I double-checked the address in the app, but it matched my current location. Maybe the customer had given the wrong address. I tried calling them, but it went straight to voicemail. I sat there for a few minutes, debating what to do. The smart thing would have been to turn around and head back to civilization. But something made me hesitate. I didn't want to let the customer down, and a small part of me was curious about this mysterious delivery location. Against my better judgment, I decided to get out and investigate a bit. I grabbed my phone and the food bag and stepped out of the car. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my feet and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shone my phone's flashlight around, but the beam seemed feeble against the vast darkness. That's when I saw it, a faint, eerie blue light floating between the trees about 50 yards away. At first I thought I was imagining things, but as I stared, I realized it was definitely there. The light bobbed slightly, as if carried by an unseen figure. A chill ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. "Uber Eats delivery." No response. The light continued to hover, unmoving. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a few tentative steps towards the light, my heart pounding. As I got closer, the light suddenly blinked out. I froze, straining my eyes to see in the darkness. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming from the direction where the light had been. My blood ran cold as I realized the footsteps were getting closer. Panic seized me and I spun around, sprinting back towards my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. Just as I managed to wrench it open, my flashlight beam caught a glimpse of a tall, dark figure emerging from the tree line. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it immediately. My trembling hands struggled to get the key in the ignition as the footsteps got closer and closer. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I stomped on the gas, tires spewing gravel as I peeled out. In my rearview mirror, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a man standing in the middle of the road, his face obscured by shadow. Then he was gone as I sped around a bend. I didn't slow down until I was back on paved roads, my knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? What was he doing out there in the middle of nowhere? And what was that strange light I saw? When I finally got home that night, I was still shaken. I reported the incident to Uber support, but they just gave me a canned response about customer safety. I tried looking up the delivery address, but found no record of any residents at that location. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I scoured local news sites, hoping to find some explanation, but there was nothing. I even drove out there again during daylight, but found no trace of anything unusual, just an empty patch of forest at the end of a dirt road. To this day, I have no idea what really happened out there. Was it some kind of prank, a hallucination brought on by fatigue, or something more sinister? All I know is that I'll never forget the terror I felt in those woods, and I've never accepted another delivery to an unfamiliar rural address since. Sometimes late at night, I still find myself thinking about that hovering blue light and the shadowy figure on the road. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. It's a question that continues to haunt me even now. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself there must be a logical explanation. But deep down, I know that what I experienced that night was something beyond normal understanding. It was as if I had briefly crossed over into some other realm, where the laws of reality don't quite apply. The incident has left me jumpy and paranoid, especially when driving at night. Every dark stretch of road, every isolated house, sends a shiver down my spine. I find myself constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall figure materialize behind me. I've thought about quitting my delivery job altogether, but the truth is, I need the money. So I keep working, but I'm much more cautious now. I never venture too far out of the city, and I always trust my gut if a delivery feels off. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get answers about what happened that night. Part of me wants to know the truth, but another part is terrified of what that truth might be. For now, all I can do is try to move on with my life and hope that whatever I encountered out there in those dark woods stays far, far away. But on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees, I can't help but remember the eerie blue light and the sound of footsteps in the darkness. And I wonder, is someone or something still out there waiting? The thought sends chills down my spine every time. I've tried talking to friends about it, but they just laugh it off or tell me I must have imagined it. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head, but it felt so real, so viscerally terrifying, that I can't just dismiss it. Sometimes I find myself obsessively researching local folklore and urban legends, looking for anything that might explain what I saw. I've even reached out to paranormal investigators, but so far no one has been able to offer any concrete answers. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the thin line between the world we know and the unexplained. Every time I drive past that turnoff to the gravel road, my heart races a little faster. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that night, but I do know that it's opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. And sometimes, in the dark of night, those things find us when we least expect it. So if you're ever out making deliveries and get a request for a strange, isolated location, think twice before accepting. You never know what might be waiting for you out there in the shadows. Take it from me. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'd been driving for about 14 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the radio blasting to keep me awake. It was around 2 a.m. and pitch black out there in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. Nothing but empty fields and the occasional flickering light from a farmhouse in the distance. I was starting to feel the fatigue set in, my eyes getting heavy. I remember thinking I should probably find a rest stop soon to catch a few hours of sleep. That's when I saw it, headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I was relieved to see another vehicle out here, but as it got closer, I realized something was off. The truck behind me was swerving erratically, speeding up and slowing down. My heart started racing as I gripped the wheel tighter. Was this guy drunk? I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the truck matched my speed, staying right on my tail. I was about to radio for help when suddenly the truck's headlights blinked out, just gone, like someone flipped a switch. I squinted into the darkness behind me, trying to make out any shape on the road. Nothing. A chill ran down my spine. Where the hell did it go? There were no turnoffs for miles. I slowed down, scanning the shoulder, wondering if maybe they'd pulled over. Still nothing. That's when I saw it. A huge semi-truck parked sideways across both lanes about a quarter-mile ahead. My blood turned to ice. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from the other truck's cab. For a few minutes, I just sat there, heart pounding. The truck was completely dark, no lights on anywhere. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to investigate, my hand shaking as I shone the beam across the vehicle. It looked like it had been parked there in a hurry. The driver's side door was wide open, keys still in the ignition. I called out, but only silence answered back. Walking around to the other side, I noticed the passenger window was shattered. Glass crunched under my boots. I climbed up to peer inside the cab. A steaming cup of coffee sat in the cup holder, still warm to the touch. A worn trucker cap and jacket were tossed on the passenger seat, but no sign of the driver anywhere. My skin was crawling at this point. Something was very wrong here. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but of course there was no signal out in this dead zone. I was on my own. I decided to check around the immediate area in case the driver had wandered off. As I walked along the shoulder, my flashlight beam caught something reflective in the grass. It was a small puddle of oil, but it wasn't coming from the abandoned truck. Following the trail, I realized with growing horror that there were tire tracks from at least 3 other vehicles leading off into a field. My mind was racing. What the hell happened here? Some kind of ambush. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard it. A low rumble in the distance, getting closer. Headlights appeared on the horizon, headed straight for me. Panic seized me as I sprinted back to my rig. I had to get out of there now. I peeled out of there as fast as I could, heart hammering in my chest. In my mirrors, I could see the approaching vehicle getting closer. It was another semi-truck, moving way too fast. I pushed my truck to the limit, praying I could outrun whatever was chasing me. The engine roared as I flew down the empty highway. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw the blessed sight of lights up ahead, a 24-hour truck stop. I screeched into the parking lot and ran inside, yelling for someone to call the police. The few bleary-eyed truckers looked at me like I was crazy as I babbled about abandoned trucks and mysterious vehicles. But they must have seen the genuine fear in my eyes, because one of them pulled out a phone. When the state troopers arrived about 30 minutes later, I told them everything. They seemed skeptical at first, but agreed to check it out. I gave them the exact location and insisted on riding along. But when we got there, the road was empty. No sign of the abandoned truck, no tire tracks, nothing. The cops were clearly annoyed, thinking I'd wasted their time. But I know what I saw. In the weeks that followed, I obsessively scoured news reports and trucker forums for any mention of a missing driver in that area. But there was nothing. It's like it never happened. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced that night. Was it some kind of elaborate heist or kidnapping? A glitch in reality? I don't know. But I do know that it could have easily been me who vanished without a trace on that lonely stretch of road. I still drive trucks for a living, but I avoid that route like the plague now. And I never, ever drive alone at night anymore. The memory of those phantom headlights in my rear view still haunts me. Whatever happened out there in the dark that night, I was lucky to escape it. I just hope that poor driver, whoever he was, somehow made it out alive too. But deep down, I know that's unlikely. Sometimes I imagine his family still waiting for him to come home, not knowing what became of him. It eats at me, not being able to help or explain what I saw. I've thought about going to the media with my story, but who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself most days. So I keep it to myself, carrying the weight of that night's events like a dark secret. All I know is that stretch of Route 66 isn't safe. Something evil lurks out there in the night, preying on lone travelers. So if you're ever driving through Oklahoma in the wee hours, keep your eyes peeled. And if you see an abandoned truck blocking the road ahead, for the love of God, don't stop. Just floor it and don't look back. Because whatever took that driver that night is still out there. And next time, it could be you. I still have nightmares about what might have happened if I'd arrived at that spot just a little earlier. Would I have been the one to disappear without a trace? The thought makes me break out in a cold sweat. In the years since, I've become almost obsessive about safety on the road. I've installed every security device I can think of in my truck. Dash cams, GPS trackers, you name it. I carry multiple phones and backup batteries. I even bought a gun, something I never thought I'd do. But deep down, I know none of that would have saved that other driver. Whatever force was at work that night, it wasn't something you could fight with normal means. I've tried to move on with my life, to forget about what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that I was meant to witness it for a reason, like I'm supposed to warn others somehow. So I guess that's what I'm doing now, putting this out there. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But on the off chance this saves even one person from whatever fate befell that missing driver, it's worth it. To all you truckers out there, all you midnight travelers, be careful, be vigilant. And if you ever find yourself on a dark, lonely stretch of highway and see something that doesn't feel right, trust your gut and get the hell out of there. Because the night is dark and full of terrors, and some of them have wheels. Stay safe out there, folks, and keep on trucking. But maybe stick to the daylight hours from now on. It was around 2 a.m., and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Seattle. The forest road stretched endlessly ahead, my high beams barely cutting through the thick darkness. I was tired, having driven for nearly 14 hours straight, but I needed to make good time. The first sign that something was off came when my radio started acting up. It had been playing some late-night talk show, but suddenly cut to static. I fiddled with the dial, but couldn't pick up any stations. Just white noise. That's when I saw him, a man standing on the shoulder of the road. He was facing away from me, completely motionless. As I got closer, I could make out more details. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long black coat, but something about his proportions seemed wrong. His arms hung down past his knees, and his neck was impossibly long and crooked. I slowed down instinctively as I approached. The logical part of my brain said it was just some hitchhiker, but every instinct was screaming at me that this was not normal. As my truck rumbled past, the figure's head slowly rotated to follow me. I caught a glimpse of its face in my side mirror, pale, gaunt, with huge black eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's. I shuddered and pressed down on the accelerator. My heart was racing as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It had to be a trick of the light, my tired mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the image of those eyes from my mind. About 15 minutes later, I came around a bend and saw someone else on the roadside. This time it was clearly a woman, wearing ripped jeans and a red hoodie. She was just standing there, staring directly at me as I approached. Her gaze was so intense it made me physically uncomfortable. I averted my eyes, not wanting to look at her. As I passed, I glanced in my mirror and saw her turning to watch my truck. She remained perfectly still otherwise, just pivoting her head to follow me. It was deeply unnerving. I was properly freaked out at this point. 2 bizarre encounters in one night was too much to be a coincidence. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? I hadn't technically seen anything illegal, just extremely creepy. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, hyper-alert, and scanning the tree line for any more figures. The forest pressed in close on both sides, and I found myself imagining how many people could be hiding in those woods, watching and waiting. That's when I saw it, a body lying in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I swerved to avoid hitting it. My truck fishtailed wildly before I managed to bring it to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, sprawled face down across the center line. He wasn't moving. Oh God, I muttered, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. I needed to call 911 to get help, but as the adrenaline faded, a chill ran down my spine. What if this wasn't an accident? What if it was a trap? I thought of all those stories about hijackers using injured victims as bait. How many people could be hiding in the woods right now, waiting for some good Samaritan to stop? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed with indecision. Eventually, my survival instinct won out. I couldn't risk getting out of the truck. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I slowly began to edge the truck forward, steering carefully around the body. As I passed it, I looked down, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing there. The road was completely empty. I nearly crashed again as I whipped my head around, searching frantically for where the body had gone. But there was no sign of it anywhere. It had vanished as if it had never existed. Panic overtook me then. I floored it, my truck roaring as I tore down the highway. I didn't care about speed limits or fuel efficiency. I just needed to get out of that forest as fast as humanly possible. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I kept seeing movement in the trees, shadows that seemed to dart alongside my truck, faces peering out from behind trunks. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. When I finally broke free of the forest, I pulled into the first rest stop I saw. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart and make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But it had felt so real. I could still see those black eyes staring at me, still feel the woman's gaze boring into me. I ended up calling my dispatcher and telling them I was too sick to continue. I couldn't bring myself to get back on that road. I spent the night in my cab, jumping at every sound and shadow. In the light of day, I tried to rationalize it all away. Stress, fatigue, and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Something inexplicable had happened on that road, something that defied logical explanation. I've avoided Route 17 ever since that night. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those figures in the darkness, watching and waiting. I don't know what their intentions were, or if they were even real, but I do know one thing. Whatever's lurking in Blackwater Forest, it isn't human, and I hope to God I never encounter it again. I never thought I'd be writing this, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened to me a few weeks ago on the road has left me shaken to my core. I'm a long-haul trucker, been doing it for over 15 years now. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out there, but nothing like this. It was supposed to be a routine run from Omaha to Fargo. I'd done this route dozens of times before. About halfway through, I was looking forward to stopping at my usual rest area. You know, the one with the decent coffee and clean bathrooms. But when I pulled up, something was off. The place was completely deserted. No cars, no lights on, nothing. It looked like it had been abandoned for months. I'll admit, it freaked me out a bit, but I figured maybe they were doing renovations or something. I decided to push on and find somewhere else to take a break. Big mistake. About an hour later, I was really feeling the fatigue setting in. My eyes were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to stop soon. That's when I saw this little pull-off area on the side of the road. It wasn't much, just a gravel patch with some scraggly trees. But it was isolated and quiet, perfect for catching a quick nap. I parked the rig and climbed into the sleeper cab. I remember checking that all the doors were locked. Force of habit, you know? I settled in and was just dozing off when I heard it. A soft tapping sound on the passenger side window. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then it came again, louder this time. My eyes shot open and I froze. There was a face pressed against the glass, staring right at me. A man, probably in his 40s, with this wild-looking beard that was part white, part brown. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I watched in horror as he started pulling on the door handle, trying to get in. When that didn't work, he began pounding on the window with his fist. I don't know what snapped me out of my paralysis, but suddenly I was scrambling for the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole time, this guy was screaming something I couldn't understand and beating on the side of the truck. Just as I got the engine started, I heard a sickening crack. He had picked up a rock and smashed the passenger window. Glass went flying everywhere. I stomped on the gas pedal so hard I thought I might break it. The tires spun in the gravel before finally catching, and I tore out of there like a bat out of hell. I drove for hours, way over the speed limit, before I finally felt safe enough to slow down. My hands were still trembling on the wheel. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, his eyes wild and desperate in the darkness. It wasn't until I reached Fargo that I finally stopped. I pulled into a well-lit truck stop and just sat there, trying to process what had happened. As the adrenaline wore off, I started to feel the cuts on my arms from the shattered glass. I hadn't even noticed them before. I called the police and filed a report, but I knew the chances of them finding the guy were slim to none. I gave them the best description I could, but it all happened so fast. And out there in the middle of nowhere, he could be long gone by now. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the attack itself. It's the realization of how close I came to, what, being robbed, kidnapped, killed? If I hadn't locked those doors, if I had been a little slower to react, my whole life could have changed in an instant. I've been back on the road since then, but things are different now. I don't stop at isolated areas anymore, no matter how tired I am. I'm constantly checking my mirrors, always on edge. That feeling of safety I used to have in my truck is gone. Sometimes I wonder about that guy. Who was he? What was he doing out there in the middle of the night? Was he desperate, on drugs, or just plain crazy? I'll probably never know. But the memory of his face, illuminated by my cab lights as he smashed through that window, is seared into my brain forever. I know I got lucky that night. A few seconds difference, and who knows what might have happened. It's a sobering reminder of how vulnerable we all are out there on the open road. So to all my fellow truckers, and really anyone who travels alone, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and always, always lock your doors. You never know what's waiting out there in the darkness. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years now. Long hauls, coast to coast, you name it. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what went down last October. It was a crisp autumn night, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the cornfields lining the highway. I'd been driving for about 10 hours straight and was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. The radio was playing some old country tunes to keep me company, but I was seriously considering pulling over at the next rest stop to catch a few hours of shut-eye. That's when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another night owl making their way across the country. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the truck behind me was maintaining a constant distance. No matter how I adjusted my speed, they stayed right there, about 100 yards back. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just using me as a pace car, letting me navigate the dark highway for both of us. But my gut was screaming that something was off. I decided to test my theory. I slowed down gradually, dropping from 65 to 55 mph. The truck behind me matched my speed perfectly. My heart started racing. This was no coincidence. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to make contact. Breaker 19, this is Big Red. You out there, driver behind me? Nothing but static. I tried again, but still no response. By this point, my palms were sweating. I was wide awake now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I debated pulling over, but the thought of stopping with that mystery truck right behind me made my skin crawl. That's when things got really weird. I glanced in my side mirror and could have sworn I saw the truck's headlights flicker and change color for a split second. It was so quick I thought I might have imagined it, but then it happened again. The bright white beams suddenly pulsed with a sickly green glow before returning to normal. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. This couldn't be real. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I contemplated pulling over again, but my instincts were screaming at me to keep moving. The next hour was the longest of my life. That truck stayed glued to my rear, those headlights occasionally flickering with that unnatural green light. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Finally, I saw a sign for an upcoming truck stop. I decided enough was enough. I needed to get off the road and figure out what the hell was going on. As I hit my turn signal and started to decelerate, I braced myself for the truck behind me to follow. But it didn't. As I took the exit ramp, I watched in disbelief as the mystery truck continued straight down the highway, maintaining its speed as if I had never existed. I pulled into the truck stop parking lot, my hands shaking as I put the rig in park. I sat there for a good 20 minutes, trying to calm my nerves and make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, just a case of road fatigue playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. After grabbing a coffee and splashing some water on my face, I decided to continue my journey. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It wasn't until I reached Denver and was unloading my cargo that I heard the news. A fellow driver mentioned that a trucker had gone missing the night before, last seen on the same stretch of highway I had been on. My blood ran cold as I listened to the details. The missing driver had radioed in about a strange truck following him, with headlights that seemed to change color. Then, nothing. His truck was found abandoned on the side of the road, no sign of the driver or any struggle. I wanted to speak up, to tell someone what I had experienced. But who would believe me? I'd sound like a lunatic, rambling about ghostly trucks with glowing green headlights. So I kept my mouth shut, but the guilt has been eating away at me ever since. I can't help but wonder, what if I had stopped? What if I had tried to help that other driver somehow? Would he still be missing? Or would I have vanished too, another victim of whatever malevolent force was out there on the highway that night? I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it all. Was it some kind of supernatural encounter? A government experiment gone wrong? Or just a twisted game being played by some sicko with too much time on their hands? I don't have any answers, but I know what I saw. And I know that I'll never feel truly safe out on the open road again. Every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror now, my heart skips a beat. I find myself watching for that telltale green flicker, praying I never see it again. I've thought about quitting trucking altogether, but this job is all I know, so I keep driving, keep moving forward, trying to outrun the memories of that night. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the feeling that something out there is watching, waiting for its next victim. To the family of that missing trucker, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't do more, didn't say something sooner. I hope someday we get answers about what happened out there. And to my fellow drivers, be careful out there. Keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. Because sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes they're right there on the highway, disguised as just another set of headlights in the night. I don't know if sharing this will help anyone or if it'll just make people think I'm crazy, but I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar, or maybe this will serve as a warning to others. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll always wonder about the trucker who wasn't as lucky as me. Stay safe out there, folks. And if you ever see a truck with headlights that flicker green, for the love of God, don't let it get behind you. Keep driving and don't look back. Because some things on this earth defy explanation, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I left my apartment around 7 p.m., later than I'd planned. The sun was already setting as I got on the highway, casting long shadows across the road. About an hour into the drive, I turned onto the narrow forest road that leads to my grandparents' remote cabin. The trees were thick on either side, branches reaching out over the road like gnarled fingers. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead. I always got a bit creeped out driving this stretch at night, but tonight felt different somehow. The forest seemed unnaturally still and quiet. As I rounded a bend, my heart nearly stopped. There in the middle of the road was a figure, illuminated in my headlights. It looked like a person, but something was off. The proportions weren't quite right. Its limbs were too long and thin, and its head was oddly shaped. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching on the pavement. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, stock still, facing away from me. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I was already more than halfway to my grandparents' place. Cell reception was spotty out here. If I turned back now, I'd be driving for over an hour with no way to call for help if I needed it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just some drunk hiker who had wandered onto the road. I honked my horn, thinking it would startle them into moving. Nothing. The figure remained motionless. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You need to move. It's not safe to stand in the road." Slowly, so slowly, the figure began to turn. I felt the blood drain from my face as it rotated to face me. Its features were blurred and indistinct in the harsh glare of my headlights, but I could make out two pinpricks of reflected light where its eyes should be. My body went cold with fear. This was no hiker. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I reached for my phone and snapped a quick picture. As soon as the flash went off, the creature's head snapped up. It let out a blood-curdling shriek that made my ears ring. Then it was charging straight for my car. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning as I tried to back up as fast as I could. The thing was inhumanly fast. In seconds, it had closed the distance between us. Long skeletal fingers scrabbled at my driver's side window. I screamed as I saw its face up close. It was like a nightmarish caricature of a human face. Sunken cheeks, skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones, and a mouth that opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Somehow, I managed to get the car turned around. I floored it, my engine roaring as I sped back the way I'd come. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see that thing chasing after me. But the road behind me remained empty. After a few miles, I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But of course there was no signal out here. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down enough to drive. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't have been real. Maybe I was having some kind of mental breakdown. But then I remembered I'd taken a picture. With trembling fingers, I pulled up my phone's camera roll. There it was. The picture was blurry and dark, but I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape standing in the road. Its proportions were all wrong, limbs too long and thin, and those pinprick eyes, reflecting the light of my flash. I nearly dropped my phone. It was real. That thing, whatever it was, had been real. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay on this dark forest road all night. I had to get somewhere safe. I called my grandparents and made up some excuse about car trouble. Then I drove straight back to the city, my heart pounding the whole way. I kept expecting to see that thing appear in my headlights again. It's been a week, and I still can't shake the fear. I can't sleep without leaving the lights on. Every shadow, every unexplained noise makes me jump. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I look at that picture on my phone, and I know it was real. I don't know what that thing was, or why it was on that road that night. Part of me wants to go back, to try to find some explanation. But a bigger part of me never wants to set foot in those woods again. I keep replaying that moment in my mind. The inhuman speed as it charged my car. Those bony fingers scraping at my window. That impossibly wide mouth full of needle teeth. Sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't been able to get away? I've debated posting the picture online, asking if anyone else has seen anything like this. But I'm scared of drawing attention to myself. What if that thing is still out there looking for me? What if posting about it somehow summons it back? So I've kept quiet, trying to go about my normal life. But I can't forget. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing pinprick eyes staring back at me. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in the forest again. I keep asking myself why. Why was it there? What did it want? Was it trying to warn me away from something? Or was I just unlucky enough to stumble across its hunting grounds? The rational part of my brain tries to come up with explanations. Maybe it was just a person in a costume, playing a sick prank. Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing due to exhaustion or stress. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and I know it wasn't human. I've done some research online, looking into local folklore and urban legends, but I haven't found anything that quite matches what I encountered. This wasn't Bigfoot or a ghost or any of the usual paranormal suspects. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world. Sometimes I wonder if I should report it to the authorities. But what would I even say? "Officer, I saw a monster on the forest road?" They'd think I was crazy or on drugs, and honestly, sometimes I wonder if I am going crazy. How do you process an experience like this? How do you go back to normal life after seeing something that shatters your entire understanding of reality? I've thought about reaching out to paranormal investigators or cryptozoologists, but I'm scared of being ridiculed or dismissed, and a part of me is terrified that digging deeper will only bring that thing back into my life somehow. So for now, I'm left with my fears and my questions. I jump at every unexpected sound. I avoid driving at night. I have nightmares about those glowing eyes and grasping fingers. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what I saw that night. To anyone reading this, be careful on those dark forest roads. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist, but do. I hope you never encounter anything like what I did. But if you do, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. I don't know why I'm sharing this. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe I'm hoping someone else out there has seen something similar and can help me make sense of it all. Or maybe I just need reassurance that I'm not going crazy. All I know is that my life changed forever on that dark forest road. I saw something that I can't explain, something that haunts me to this day, and I'll never look at the world the same way again. As I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, I noticed there were only a couple other vehicles there, an old RV and a pickup truck. The place had an eerie, abandoned feel to it, but I was too exhausted to care. I parked near the restroom building, reclined my seat, and tried to get comfortable enough to catch a quick nap. I must have dozed off for a bit, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. My heart racing, I sat up and peered out the windows, trying to figure out where the noise had come from. That's when I saw him, a tall, shadowy figure lurking near the restrooms, methodically pounding on the metal doors. A chill ran down my spine as I watched this stranger move from door to door, seemingly checking if they were locked. His movements were oddly rigid and mechanical. Even from a distance, something about him just felt off. I sank lower in my seat, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But then he suddenly stopped and turned his head in my direction. Even though I couldn't make out his face clearly, I could feel his eyes boring into me. My breath caught in my throat as we stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, he started walking purposefully towards my car. Panic flooded through me as I fumbled to start the engine with shaking hands. Just as he was about to reach me, I managed to throw the car into reverse and peel out of there, tires squealing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see headlights following me. But the road behind me remained empty and dark. After driving for about 20 minutes, I started to calm down a bit. I told myself I had probably just freaked myself out over nothing. It was late, I was exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The guy was probably just some harmless weirdo. Still, I didn't want to risk stopping again, so I cranked up the radio and pushed on through the night. Just as I was starting to feel safe again, my blood ran cold. There, on the side of the road ahead, I saw a familiar figure. It was impossible. I'd left that rest stop miles behind. But somehow, The same tall man was there, his arm outstretched, thumb up in the universal hitchhiker signal. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating from lack of sleep. But when I looked again, he was still there. As I sped past him, I caught a glimpse of his face in my headlights. What I saw made me want to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. His face was eerily blank, almost like a mannequin, with black holes where the eyes should be. Thoroughly freaked out now, I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. I didn't care about speed limits anymore. I just needed to put as much distance between me and whatever that thing was as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept obsessively checking my mirrors, terrified I'd see him again. The rational part of my brain was saying this couldn't be real, but the primal fear I felt was all too real. After about an hour of driving like a maniac, I finally saw signs of civilization ahead, a 24-hour diner just off the highway. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm my ragged breathing. Eventually, I worked up the courage to go inside. The fluorescent lights and smell of coffee were comforting after the darkness of the highway. There were a few truckers scattered around and a bored-looking waitress behind the counter. I slid into a booth and ordered some coffee with shaking hands. As the caffeine started to hit my system, I began to feel a little more clear-headed. In the light of day, it all seemed so ridiculous. I must have dozed off at the wheel and had some kind of waking nightmare. There was no way that creature could have actually been real, let alone teleported down the highway. I was just overtired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd check the news while I finished my coffee. But as soon as I unlocked the screen, my blood turned to ice. There, filling my screen, was a grainy image that looked like it had been taken from a security camera. It showed the rest area parking lot and my car. And there, clear as day, was the tall figure standing right next to my driver's side window, staring directly at the camera with that horrible blank face. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. How was this possible? I hadn't taken any pictures at the rest stop. Where had this image come from, and how had it gotten onto my phone? I looked around the diner wildly, half expecting to see that terrible figure standing there. But it was just the same scattered handful of tired truckers. The waitress gave me an odd look, probably wondering why I suddenly looked like I'd seen a ghost. I quickly paid my bill and practically ran back to my car. I don't think I've ever driven so fast in my life. I didn't stop again until I was safely home, with the doors locked behind me. It's been weeks now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. I've racked my brain trying to come up with some rational explanation, but I keep coming up empty. All I know is that I'll never stop at a rest area in the middle of the night ever again. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on dark roads, I catch myself obsessively checking the rearview mirror, just in case. The image is still on my phone. I've tried deleting it countless times, but it always reappears. Sometimes I wonder if I should show it to someone, but I'm terrified of what might happen if I do. What if sharing it somehow summons that thing? So for now, I keep it to myself. This digital proof of a nightmare I can't explain or forget. I don't know what that creature was or what it wanted from me. All I know is that I've never felt fear like I did that night. It was a primal, bone-deep terror that I can still feel echoes of whenever I think about it. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that metallic banging sound from my dreams. I've tried researching similar encounters online, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The closest I've found are some creepy urban legends about phantom hitchhikers, but even those pale in comparison to the reality of what I saw. Part of me wonders if I'll ever see that thing again. Another part of me desperately hopes I won't. All I know for sure is that I'll never look at a lonely highway rest stop the same way again. What should have been a quick, forgettable pit stop turned into the most horrifying night of my life, one that I'm still trying to make sense of weeks later. If you're reading this and you've had any similar experiences, please reach out. I need to know I'm not crazy, that I'm not the only one who's encountered something like this. And if you haven't, well, take my advice and think twice before pulling over at that quiet rest area in the dead of night. You never know what might be waiting for you in the shadows. The first few days were great. We explored the town, had barbecues in the backyard, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. But things took a terrifying turn on our last night there. My family had left earlier that day since I had to stay back for a work call. I was alone in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, when I heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. At first I brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe a squirrel on the roof, but then I heard it again, a soft creak, like someone trying to walk quietly across an old wooden floor. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but a pit formed in my stomach. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just silence. I slowly got up from the table, my legs shaking. I grabbed a kitchen knife and started creeping towards the stairs, straining my ears for any sound. As I reached the bottom step, I heard another creak from above, followed by what sounded like a drawer sliding open. Panic gripped me. Someone was definitely up there, going through our things. I wanted to run out of the house screaming, but I was paralyzed with fear. What if they had a weapon? What if there was more than one person? I stood there at the bottom of the stairs, knife clutched in my trembling hand, for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced through all the horrible possibilities. Then I heard quick, light footsteps moving across the upstairs hallway towards the back of the house. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. As soon as I got it open, I ran out into the yard, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see someone chasing after me, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent house looming behind me. I ran to my car and locked myself inside, frantically dialing 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept my eyes glued to the house, watching for any sign of movement. But everything was still. When the cops showed up, they did a thorough search of the house and property. They didn't find anyone, but there were clear signs someone had been there. Drawers were open in the bedrooms, and some of our belongings were scattered on the floor. Most disturbingly, some cash and a couple of small electronics were missing from my suitcase. The police took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I grabbed my essential belongings and checked into a hotel in town. As I lay in the hotel bed that night, unable to sleep, my mind kept replaying everything that had happened. But then a chilling thought struck me. What if the intruder had been in the house even earlier, when my family was still there? We had all commented on how some things seemed slightly out of place or moved during our stay, but we'd brushed it off as our own absent-mindedness. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that someone had been watching us, learning our routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. Had they been hiding in closets or crawl spaces while we slept? The thought made me sick to my stomach, but it got even worse. As I was packing up to leave the next morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, tucked in a corner of my suitcase, was a small scrap of paper I didn't recognize. With trembling hands, I unfolded it and read the hastily scrawled message. "Thanks for staying. Come back soon." I nearly threw up. The intruder hadn't just been watching us, they'd been taunting us, playing some sick game, and worst of all, they wanted us to come back. I reported the note to the police, but they said without any fingerprints or clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to warn the Airbnb hosts and leave a bad review to alert future guests. It's been months since that nightmare of a vacation, but I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've become paranoid, always checking locks and peering out windows. I can't stay in hotels or vacation rentals anymore. The thought of sleeping in a strange place fills me with dread. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of work and life had caused me to have some kind of breakdown. But then I remember that note and the pure terror I felt that night, and I know it was all too real. I don't know who that intruder was or what their intentions were. Were they just a thief, a stalker, something worse? I'll probably never know. But I do know one thing. I'll never feel truly safe in my own home again. The idea that someone could be hiding, watching, waiting, it haunts me every day. So if you're reading this and planning a trip, please be careful. Triple check the locks. Trust your instincts if something feels off. And remember, just because you can't see someone doesn't mean they can't see you. I hope sharing my story helps someone avoid going through what I did. Stay safe out there and always be aware of your surroundings. You never know who might be watching. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain pounding against the roof. I've always found storms oddly comforting, so I made myself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch with a good book. Everything was fine at first. The power was still on. I was warm and cozy inside. But then, around 9 p.m., the lights suddenly flickered and went out. I wasn't too worried at that point. Power outages weren't uncommon during big storms in our area. I fumbled around in the dark for a few minutes before finding a flashlight and some candles. I lit a few candles around the living room, giving the space an eerie, flickering glow. The sudden silence was unsettling. Without the hum of electronics, all I could hear was the wind and rain outside. I tried to go back to my book, but I kept getting distracted by every little noise, the creaking of the house, branches scraping against the siding. My nerves were on edge. I kept glancing out the windows into the pitch-black night. That's when I saw it, a face pressed up against my living room window. My blood ran cold. It was only there for a second before disappearing, but I'll never forget that image. A man's face, dripping wet, eyes wide and staring right at me. He was mouthing something, but I couldn't make it out. I jumped up, heart pounding. I ran to the window, but there was no one there, just darkness and rain. I told myself I must have imagined it, that the candlelight was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. With shaking hands, I closed all the curtains and locked every door and window in the house. I huddled on the couch, straining my ears for any sound of someone outside. The storm raged on, masking any other noises. After about an hour of tense silence, I started to relax a little. Maybe I really had imagined that face. I was just on edge from the storm and blackout. I decided to try to get some sleep. There wasn't much else I could do in the dark anyway. I made my way upstairs to my bedroom, bringing a candle with me. I left it burning on my nightstand as I got into bed, too unsettled to sleep in total darkness. Despite my nerves, exhaustion eventually took over and I drifted off. I'm not sure how long I slept before a loud crash jolted me awake. My eyes flew open, heart racing. For a moment I was disoriented in the darkness. The candle had gone out. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass downstairs. Pure terror gripped me. Someone was in my house. I lay frozen in bed, hardly daring to breathe. I could hear movement downstairs, careful footsteps, things being moved around. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was downstairs charging. There was no way to call for help. I knew I had to get out of the house somehow. Slowly, silently, I eased myself out of bed. Every tiny creak of the floorboard sounded deafening to my ears. I crept to my bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. It was pitch black, but I could still hear movement downstairs. I inched my way down the hall towards the stairs, clinging to the wall. When I reached the top of the staircase, I paused. The noises had stopped. Was the intruder still down there? Had they heard me? I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then a floorboard creaked right at the bottom of the stairs. He was coming up. Panic exploded in my chest. I spun around and bolted back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled with trembling hands to lock it, then backed away. What now? I was trapped. The window was my only escape, but it was a long drop to the ground. As I stood there paralyzed with indecision, I heard slow footsteps in the hall, getting closer. They stopped right outside my door. I could see a shadow blocking the faint light from under the door. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. Then, mercifully, a sound broke through the terrifying silence. Police sirens in the distance, getting closer. The shadow under my door disappeared. I heard rapid footsteps going back downstairs, then the sound of a door slamming. I sank to the floor, weak with relief. But I didn't move from that spot until I heard banging on my front door and voices shouting, "Police! Is anyone home?" When I finally made it downstairs, flanked by 2 officers, I saw the broken glass from my back window scattered across the kitchen floor. They did a thorough search of the house and property, but found no sign of the intruder. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one targeted that night. There had been multiple break-in attempts in the neighborhood, all during the storm and blackout. The police think it was someone taking advantage of the chaos to rob houses. They never caught the guy. To this day, I don't know if the face I saw in my window earlier that night was real or my imagination, but I'll never forget the terror of those moments hiding in my room, listening to those footsteps getting closer. I've since installed a security system, and I never stay in the house alone during storms anymore, but I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. The sound of breaking glass, footsteps on the stairs, that shadow under my door. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling so loud it seemed like it might tear the roof right off. I was trying to distract myself by binge-watching shows on Netflix, but the storm kept cutting the power on and off. During one of the outages, I heard a weird noise coming from the basement. It was faint, but distinct, like something heavy had fallen over. My first thought was that one of the shelves down there had collapsed from all the shaking. I really didn't want to go check it out, but I knew my dad would kill me if I let water damage or something go unchecked. So I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and slowly made my way down the creaky old stairs to the basement. The beam from my phone barely cut through the pitch blackness, I could hear water dripping somewhere, and the air felt damp and musty. As I swept the light around, everything seemed normal at first, just the usual piles of boxes and old furniture. But then I noticed that my dad's trophy case had tipped over, spilling decades' worth of sports awards across the floor. I started picking up the trophies, figuring I could at least stack them neatly until I could fix the case. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a baseball trophy from 1998 that I'd never seen before. It looked old and tarnished, nothing like my dad's usual shiny awards. I was examining it closely when suddenly the power flickered back on. In that split second of illumination, I saw a figure crouched in the far corner of the basement. My blood ran cold. I blinked, hoping it was just a shadow or my eyes playing tricks. But when the lights came on fully, there was no mistaking it. A man was huddled there, staring right at me with wide, feral eyes. I don't even remember screaming. 1 second I was frozen in shock. The next I was scrambling up the basement stairs as fast as I could. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after me, getting closer with each second. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I made it to the top of the stairs and slammed the door behind me, fumbling with trembling hands to turn the lock. But there was no lock. We'd never needed one before. I leaned all my weight against the door, praying it would hold. Boom! The door shuddered as the intruder slammed into it from the other side. I yelled out, hoping maybe a neighbor would hear, but the storm drowned out everything. Another massive impact nearly knocked me off my feet. I knew I couldn't hold it much longer. In desperation, I bolted for the front door. If I could just get outside, maybe I could run to a neighbor's house. But in my panic, I tripped over the entry rug and went sprawling. My head cracked against the tile floor, and for a moment everything went fuzzy. I don't know how long I lay there, dazed and aching. It could have been seconds or minutes. When I finally managed to lift my head, the house was silent except for the raging storm outside. Slowly, painfully, I dragged myself to my feet. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table, ready to defend myself. But as I crept back towards the basement door, I realized it was standing wide open. My breath caught in my throat as I peered down the dark stairway. There was no sign of movement, no sound of breathing. I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself inching down those stairs, clutching the vase like a lifeline. When I reached the bottom, I fumbled for the light switch with a trembling hand. The basement flooded with harsh fluorescent light, revealing nothing. Just the same cluttered space as always, with the fallen trophy case, the only sign that anything had been disturbed. I searched every nook and cranny, but there was no trace of the intruder. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The only thing out of place was a small window near the ceiling that was now slightly ajar, letting in a trickle of rain. Had I imagined the whole thing? But no. The fear had been too real, the chase up the stairs too vivid. I ran back upstairs and called the police with shaking hands. They arrived quickly, lights flashing through the storm. I babbled out my story as they searched the house and yard. They found muddy footprints by the basement window, confirming someone had been there. But there was no other evidence, no fingerprints, nothing stolen. The officers were kind, but seemed skeptical of my account. They suggested maybe it was just a transient seeking shelter from the storm, someone who fled when they realized the house was occupied. But that didn't explain the maniacal look in the man's eyes, or why he'd chased me so aggressively. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. I called my parents the next morning, and they cut their trip short to come home early. They were upset about the break-in, but seemed to think I was overreacting a bit. Dad even joked that maybe I'd been watching too many horror movies. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those wild eyes seared into my brain. I've begged my parents to install better security, but they insist it was just a one-time thing. They don't understand why I still get nervous every time it storms, or why I refuse to go in the basement alone. The weirdest part is that trophy I found, the old tarnished one from 1998. When I went to look for it the next day, it was gone. I've asked my dad about it, but he swears he's never owned a trophy from that year. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined that detail in all the chaos and fear. But then I remember how real it felt in my hands, how out of place it seemed among the other awards. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he really was just a desperate person seeking shelter. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. Why was he hiding instead of asking for help? Why chase me so aggressively? And what happened to that mysterious trophy? I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any similar incidents in our area. But there's nothing, no pattern of break-ins, no reports of a man matching that description. It's like he appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as quickly. I know I should probably let it go. After all, nothing really happened. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen. But I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I'm home alone, every time I hear an unexpected noise, I'm right back in that basement, staring into those crazed eyes. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but they always steer the conversation towards anxiety and PTSD. They don't seem to believe that there could be more to the story, but I know what I experienced. Something strange happened that night, something I can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe in this house again. I count down the days until I can leave for college, desperate for a fresh start somewhere new. But a part of me worries that wherever I go, whatever I do, the memory of that night will always be lurking in the shadows, waiting to send chills down my spine. I don't know why I'm sharing all this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has experienced something similar, that I'm not alone in this. Or maybe I just need to get it off my chest, to put it all down in words, so I can convince myself it was real. Because the alternative, that my mind could conjure up something so terrifying, is almost worse than the reality of what happened. All I know is that I'll never forget that stormy night, the glint of that strange trophy in the darkness, and the heart-stopping terror of realizing I wasn't alone in that basement. Whatever the truth is, it changed me. And I have a feeling I'll be looking over my shoulder for a long, long time to come. Still can't believe what happened to me last week. It's been days, and I'm still shaken up about it. I keep replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, but I just can't. It was a typical Friday night, and I was working late at the office, trying to finish up some reports before the weekend. By the time I finally wrapped everything up, it was well past 10 p.m. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, take a hot shower, and crash into bed. As I walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot, I had this weird feeling like I was being watched. I glanced around nervously but didn't see anyone. I chalked it up to being tired and paranoid from working so late. I got in my car and started the 40-minute drive home. About 15 minutes in, I noticed my fuel gauge dropping rapidly, way faster than it should have been. Before I knew it, the low fuel warning light came on. I was baffled. I had just filled up the tank that morning on my way to work. How could I possibly be almost out of gas already? Panic started to set in as I realized I was on a dark, isolated stretch of highway with no gas stations for miles. I tried to stay calm and keep driving, hoping I could make it to the next exit. But within minutes, my car started sputtering and lurching. I barely managed to pull over onto the narrow shoulder before it died completely. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call for help. But of course, there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. I was completely stranded. I sat there for what felt like hours, cars whooshing by in the darkness, my heart pounding. I kept trying my phone, but still nothing. I was debating whether I should try to flag someone down or if that would be too dangerous when I saw headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. A large pickup truck slowed down and pulled up behind me. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone was stopping to help. But as the driver's door opened and a man stepped out, that relief quickly turned to dread. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was off about him. He was tall and burly, wearing a dirty baseball cap and a flannel shirt. But it was the way he moved, slow and deliberate, almost predatory, that set off alarm bells in my head. He approached my window, and I cracked it open slightly, trying to appear grateful but cautious. "Having some car trouble?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I nodded. "Yeah, I ran out of gas somehow. My tank was full this morning. I think there might be a leak or something." The man's lips curled into what I can only describe as a knowing smirk. "Is that right? Well, ain't that a shame? Want me to take a look?" Every instinct was screaming at me not to let this guy anywhere near my car, but I also didn't want to seem rude or suspicious. "Oh, that's okay," I said quickly. "I already called for a tow truck. They should be here soon." He raised an eyebrow. "That's so? Funny, I didn't think you'd get much cell service out here." My blood ran cold. He knew I was lying. "Tell you what," he continued. "Why don't you hop in my truck and I'll give you a lift to the nearest gas station? It's a good 10 miles up the road." No, that's all right," I stammered. "I'll just wait here for the tow truck. But thank you for stopping." His expression darkened. "Now don't be like that. I'm just trying to help out a fellow traveler in need. It ain't safe for you to be sitting out here all alone." He took a step closer to my car, and I instinctively reached to lock the doors. That's when I noticed movement in his truck. I squinted through the darkness, and my heart nearly stopped. There was someone in the back seat. I could just make out a figure slumped over, head lolling to the side. Were they unconscious? Or worse? The man must have seen where I was looking because he quickly moved to block my view. "Last chance," he growled. "Either you come with me willingly, or things are going to get real unpleasant real quick." I was frozen in terror, unable to speak or move. Just then, headlights appeared on the horizon. Another car was approaching. The man cursed under his breath and took a step back. "Looks like it's your lucky day," he sneered. "But don't think this is over. I'll be seeing you again real soon." With that, he turned and strode back to his truck. I watched in my mirrors as he peeled away, tires screeching. As he sped off into the night, I realized with horror that his license plate was missing. The other car ended up being an actual Good Samaritan who helped me get gas and on my way home. But I couldn't shake the terrifying encounter from my mind. Who was that man? What was he planning to do to me? And who was that person in his back seat? I reported everything to the police, but they said without a license plate number or any other identifying information, there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they weren't taking it too seriously. It's been a week now, and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man's leering face. I keep replaying the what-ifs in my mind. What if that other car hadn't come along when it did? What would have happened to me? and I can't stop thinking about that person in his truck. Were they okay? Did I witness a kidnapping in progress? Should I have done more to try to help them? I've been obsessively checking the local news for any reports of missing persons or found bodies, but so far nothing. It's like the whole thing never happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I remember the pure evil I saw in that man's eyes, and I know it was real. I had my car thoroughly checked out by a mechanic. Sure enough, there was a clean slice in my gas tank, right where it would drain fastest while driving. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my car to strand me on that lonely stretch of road. The whole thing feels like some kind of twisted nightmare that I can't wake up from. I'm jumpy and paranoid all the time now. I bought a dash cam and pepper spray. I vary my routes to and from work. I never stay late at the office anymore, but none of it makes me feel safe. That man is still out there somewhere, and he said he'd be seeing me again soon. Was that just an empty threat, or is he watching me, waiting for another opportunity? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. All I know is that evil is real, and it's closer than we think. Be careful out there, folks. You never know who might be waiting on a dark road, ready to pounce when you're at your most vulnerable. I was working the late shift at Joe's Coffee Hut, a tiny drive-through cafe on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet Tuesday night in October, cold and rainy. The kind of night where you just want to curl up at home with a good book and a warm drink. Instead, I was stuck manning the drive-through window until 2 a.m. I didn't mind the late shifts usually. The pay was better, and it was mostly peaceful. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and the occasional insomniac looking for a caffeine fix. But that night felt different somehow. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Around midnight, the rain really started coming down. I could hear it drumming on the metal roof, drowning out the low hum of the refrigerators. I was wiping down the counters for the 100th time when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the back door. At first, I thought it was just a branch blown by the wind, but then I heard it again, more insistent this time. My heart started racing. Who would be at the back door this late at night? We never got deliveries after 8 p.m. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or just ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept towards the back, straining my ears. The tapping had stopped, but now I could hear something else. The sound of heavy breathing, like someone was standing just on the other side of the door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I told myself I was being silly, that it was probably just a raccoon or something. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was very, very wrong. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Then a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing mere inches away from me. I let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backwards. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He was soaking wet, his clothes clinging to his skeletal frame. But the most unsettling thing was what he was wearing, a tattered suit that looked like it was from another era, complete with a stained cravat around his neck. Before I could slam the door shut, he shoved his way inside. I scrambled backwards, knocking over a stack of cups in my panic. He just stood there, water pooling around his feet, staring at me with those unblinking eyes. "You shouldn't be here," I managed to stammer out. "We're closed. You need to leave." He tilted his head, reminding me of a bird of prey eyeing its next meal. When he spoke, his voice was raspy, as if he wasn't used to talking. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a request. I felt my blood turn to ice. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, did it? I frantically looked around for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. But I was backed into a corner, with nothing but coffee machines between me and this nightmare of a man. He took a step towards me, his movements jerky and unnatural. I could smell him now, a sickly sweet odor of decay and dampness. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. "There's a place in the woods," he rasped. "A special place. I've been waiting for someone like you." I shook my head frantically. "No, please, I don't want to go anywhere. Just leave me alone." But he kept advancing, reaching out with long, bony fingers. I could see dirt caked under his yellowed nails. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. Just then, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled into the drive-thru. The man's head snapped towards the sound, his face contorting in anger. "No," he hissed. "Not now. Not when I'm so close." I seized my chance and bolted for the front of the store. I could hear him right behind me, his ragged breathing in my ear. I threw myself at the drive-thru window, practically falling through it as I wrenched it open. "Help!" I screamed. "Please help me!" The car at the window was a police cruiser. The officer inside looked startled, then alarmed as he took in my terrified expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, already reaching for his gun. "There's a man," I gasped. "He broke in. He tried to take me." The officer was out of his car in an instant, radio in hand as he called for backup. I pointed towards the back of the store, where I'd last seen the intruder. But when we went to look, he was gone. The back door was wide open, swinging in the wind. The next few hours were a blur. More police arrived, taking my statement and dusting for fingerprints. They searched the woods behind the cafe, but found no trace of the man. If it wasn't for the muddy footprints on the floor and the security camera footage, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed a tall, thin man in old-fashioned clothes entering through the back door. We watched as he cornered me, advancing with those unnatural movements. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone, fleeing out the back door mere seconds before the police car pulled up. They never found him. The case is still open, but leads have gone cold. Sometimes I wonder if he was even human. The way he moved, the look in his eyes. It was like something out of a nightmare. I quit my job at the cafe that night. I couldn't bear the thought of working there again, always wondering if he might come back. For weeks afterwards, I jumped at every shadow, convinced he was lurking just out of sight. Even now, months later, I can't shake the fear. I avoid being alone at night. I triple-check my locks before bed, and I never, ever go near the woods behind my old workplace. Because sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling, I swear I can hear his voice carried on the breeze, calling me, waiting for me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I came closer to disappearing forever that night than I ever want to admit. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if that police officer hadn't shown up when he did? Where would that man have taken me? What special place was waiting for me in those dark, forbidding woods? I guess I'll never know. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Some questions are better left unanswered. But I'll never forget the night I almost became another statistic, another unsolved mystery. The night I looked into the face of true evil and somehow lived to tell the tale. So if you're reading this, working a late shift somewhere quiet and isolated, please be careful. Keep your doors locked. Stay alert. And if you hear a tapping at your door on a rainy night, don't answer it. You never know what might be waiting on the other side. I was so excited for my first solo camping trip in the Cascades. As an avid hiker but newbie camper, I had meticulously planned and packed for weeks. The weather forecast looked perfect, cool and clear. I hit the trail early that morning, my backpack heavy but spirits high. The hike started out beautifully. The air was crisp and clean, birds were chirping, and the views of snow-capped peaks were breathtaking. I felt so alive and at peace in nature. By mid-afternoon, I had covered a good 8 miles and decided to start looking for a campsite. That's when things took a bizarre turn. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I nearly ran into a man standing motionless in the middle of the path. He was tall and gaunt, wearing only jeans and a thin t-shirt despite the chilly mountain air. No backpack, no gear, just standing there staring off into the distance. I called out a friendly "Hey there" as I approached, but he didn't respond or even look my way. It was unsettling. As I got closer, I noticed his clothes were filthy and torn. His hair was long and matted. He looked like he'd been out here for weeks. "You okay, man?" I asked as I got within a few feet of him. He slowly turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were completely vacant, like there was nothing behind them. After an uncomfortable silence, he mumbled something I couldn't make out, and then just went back to staring ahead blankly. Every instinct told me to get away from this guy fast. I quickened my pace and hurried past him, heart pounding. As soon as I was around the bend and out of sight, I broke into a jog. After about 10 minutes, I found a nice little clearing and decided to make camp there for the night. As I was setting up my tent, I kept glancing nervously over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease after that weird encounter. Just as I was about to start cooking dinner, I heard a twig snap nearby. I spun around, and there he was, the strange man from the trail, standing at the edge of my campsite and staring right at me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Jesus, man, you scared the crap out of me," I said with a nervous laugh, trying to play it cool. "Can I help you with something?" He just kept staring, unblinking. Then he took a step towards me. I instinctively backed up. "Listen, buddy, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I've got some extra food if you're hungry." Another step closer. I could see his eyes now. They were bloodshot and wild-looking. My heart was racing. "Seriously, man, what do you want?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. That's when he lunged at me. I don't know if he was trying to grab me or what, but I didn't stick around to find out. I turned and ran full speed into the woods, leaving all my gear behind. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me. I ran blindly through the darkening forest, branches whipping my face. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was I had to get away from that maniac. After what felt like hours of running and hiding, I finally lost him. I found myself alone in pitch blackness, exhausted and terrified. I spent that night huddled under a rocky overhang, jumping at every sound. As soon as it was light enough to see, I started making my way down the mountain. It took most of the day, but I finally reached the trailhead and my car. I immediately drove to the nearest ranger station and reported what happened. They took my statement, but didn't seem too concerned. Said they'd send someone to check it out, but that it was probably just a homeless guy or something. It's been a few weeks now, and I still have nightmares about those dead eyes staring at me. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was on drugs or mentally ill. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something truly evil out there in those woods. I keep wanting to go back and get my gear, but I'm too scared. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at the scratches on my arms from running through the forest, and I know it was real. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. Was he trying to rob me? Hurt me? I'll never know. Part of me wants answers, but a bigger part hopes I never encounter that man again. The few friends I've told about this think I'm exaggerating or making it up, but I know what I saw. There was something seriously wrong with that guy. It wasn't just that he looked out of place or was acting weird. There was an aura of menace and wrongness about him that I can't fully explain. I've always loved nature and felt at peace in the wilderness. But now when I think about those vast, empty forests, I can't help but wonder what else might be out there, hiding in the shadows. I used to worry about bears or mountain lions. Now I know there are much scarier things to fear. I've done some research since then, and apparently there have been other strange encounters reported in that area over the years. Missing hikers, unexplained sounds at night, weird tracks found. Nothing definitively linked, but it makes me wonder. Sometimes I think about trying to organize a group to go back out there and search for clues. But then I remember the terror I felt that night, and I know I could never step foot on that mountain again. The mystery will have to remain unsolved. I still go hiking occasionally, but never alone and never in remote areas. I'm hyper-vigilant now, always scanning my surroundings. That one encounter changed how I view the world. I no longer feel safe and carefree in nature like I used to. I've tried to put it out of my mind and move on with my life. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear twigs snapping outside my window. In those moments, I'm right back in those dark woods, running for my life from an unknown threat. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over what happened out there. Part of me is still on that mountain, forever running from a nightmare I can't escape. I just hope that by sharing my story, I can warn others to be careful out there. You never know what or who you might encounter in the wilderness. The scariest part is that I'll never know for sure what that man's intentions were or where he came from. Did he live out there? Was he some kind of predator stalking lone hikers? Or was he something else, something not quite human? I try not to let my mind go there, but in my darkest moments, I can't help but wonder. I've thought about seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, but I'm afraid they'll just think I'm crazy, so I keep it bottled up inside, reliving it over and over. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That one chance encounter in the woods changed me forever. So if you're planning a solo camping trip, especially in remote areas, please be careful. Trust your instincts, and maybe bring a buddy, because you never know what's waiting for you out there in the wild. Stay safe, fellow hikers, and watch your backs. It was late June, and I had finally worked up the courage to go on my first real camping trip. I'd always loved the idea of sleeping under the stars, but growing up in the city, I never had the chance. So when a local outdoor group advertised a beginner-friendly weekend trip, I jumped at the opportunity. The first day went pretty smoothly. We hiked to the campsite, set up our tents, and had a nice cookout around the fire. That's where I met TJ. He seemed friendly enough, outgoing, funny, clearly more experienced than most of us newbies. When he overheard me telling someone it was my first time camping, he came over and struck up a conversation. "First timer, huh? How are you liking it so far?" TJ asked with an easy smile. I told him I was having a great time, but felt a little overwhelmed by all the new experiences. He nodded knowingly. "Yeah, it can be a lot to take in at first, but you picked a great spot for your first trip. Hey, if you want, I can show you something really cool tomorrow. There's this hidden lake not far from here. Absolutely gorgeous, but most people don't know about it. What do you say?" I hesitated for a moment. I didn't really know this guy, and wandering off into the woods didn't seem like the smartest idea. But TJ had such an easygoing, trustworthy demeanor, and I didn't want to seem like a paranoid newbie. So I agreed. The next morning, TJ and I set off early. He said it would only take about an hour to reach the lake. As we hiked, he pointed out different plants and wildlife, clearly knowledgeable about the area. I started to relax, feeling lucky to have made such a cool new friend. But after we'd been walking for well over an hour, with no sign of any lake, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed to be getting denser, darker, and TJ's chatty demeanor had shifted. He'd grown quiet, almost brooding. TJ, are you sure we're going the right way? We've been walking for a while now, I ventured nervously. He didn't answer right away, which only increased my anxiety. When he finally spoke, his voice had a cold edge to it that sent chills down my spine. Just a bit further, we're almost there. My heart started racing. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "You know what? I'm actually getting pretty tired. Maybe we should head back to camp." TJ stopped walking and slowly turned to face me. The friendly guy from last night was gone. His eyes were dark, predatory. A slight smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, we can't go back now. We've come so far already." Panic flooded through me. I took an involuntary step backwards, my eyes darting around for an escape route. In that moment of hesitation, TJ lunged forward, grabbing for my arm. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I managed to dodge his grasp, stumbling backwards. "Help! Somebody help me!" I screamed. Though I knew we were probably too far from camp for anyone to hear, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear TJ pursuing me, his footsteps pounding the forest floor. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I fled blindly through the woods. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but stark terror kept me moving. Suddenly I heard a whistling sound, followed by a dull thud. I glanced back to see a knife quivering in the trunk of a tree, just inches from where I'd been running. The realization that he was actually trying to kill me sent a fresh wave of panic through my body. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp. At some point, I no longer heard TJ behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. I just kept running and running until finally, miraculously, I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at the campground. Gasping for air, I stumbled towards a group of startled campers. "Help! Please!" "He tried to kill me," I managed to choke out before collapsing to my knees. The next few hours passed in a blur. Someone called the police. I gave a statement, still shaking uncontrollably. They organized a search party to look for TJ, but found no trace of him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. As I sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping water and trying to process what had happened, one of the older campers approached me. She had a grave look on her face. "I hate to ask this, but was the man who attacked you about 6 feet tall, dark hair, went by TJ?" I nodded, confused. Yes, that's him. Do you know him?" She sighed heavily. "I was afraid of that. There have been rumors for years about a predator who targets inexperienced campers in this area. Always uses a fake name, always disappears without a trace. But no one's ever gotten a good description before." A chill ran down my spine as the full weight of how close I'd come to death settled over me. If I'd been a little slower, a little less lucky, I probably would have become another missing person statistic, my fate unknown. The police never found TJ, or whoever he really was. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, looking for his next victim. Other times I try to convince myself it was all just a terrible nightmare. But then I'll catch a glimpse of the scars on my arms from the branches that tore at me as I ran for my life. and I know it was all too real. I haven't been camping since that day. I'm not sure I ever will again. The outdoors used to represent freedom and adventure to me. Now it just feels like danger lurking behind every tree. I know that's probably irrational, but I can't shake the fear. If you're reading this and planning a camping trip, especially if you're new to it, please be careful. Don't go off alone with someone you just met, no matter how friendly they seem. Trust your instincts if something feels off, and maybe bring some pepper spray, just in case. I was lucky. I survived to tell my story, but I can't help wondering about the others who may not have been so fortunate. How many missing hikers and campers over the years were actually TJ's victims? How long has he been doing this? And most chillingly, will he ever be stopped? I don't have answers to those questions. All I know is that my brush with death in those woods changed me forever. The carefree, trusting person I was before that day is gone. In his place is someone warier, more cautious, and haunted by memories of a hidden lake that never existed, and the monster who nearly made it my final resting place. So if you're heading into the great outdoors, remember my story. Stay safe out there. And if you meet a friendly guy named TJ who wants to show you a secret spot, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. I'd been driving all day in my old pickup truck, winding through narrow mountain roads and vast stretches of wilderness. As night fell, I started looking for a good spot to camp. I wasn't interested in crowded campgrounds. I wanted to really feel like I was out in nature. Eventually, I turned down an unmarked dirt road that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. After about 15 minutes of slow driving, I came to a small clearing that looked perfect. There was just enough open space to park my truck, surrounded on all sides by dense pine forest. The stars were coming out, and I could hear the faint sound of a creek somewhere nearby. It felt peaceful and secluded, exactly what I was looking for. I backed my truck up to the edge of the clearing so I could sleep in the bed. I had a camper shell over it with a foam mattress inside, making for a cozy little sleeping area. After a quick dinner of canned soup heated on my camp stove, I settled in for the night. The cool mountain air felt refreshing after a long day of driving. I must have dozed off for a while, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of an engine. At first I was disoriented, unsure where I was or what was happening. Then I remembered I was camping and felt a jolt of fear. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I kept perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as I heard a vehicle approaching. The headlights swept across the clearing, and I caught a glimpse of a battered old SUV as it pulled in and parked about 30 feet from my truck. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they must be able to hear it. 2 men got out, slamming their doors. Even in the dim moonlight, I could tell they looked rough. Big guys in dirty clothes with long, unkempt hair. They were talking in low voices, and I strained to make out what they were saying, but couldn't catch more than a few mumbled words. I was starting to panic. Why were they here? What did they want? I was alone and completely vulnerable. My phone had no signal out here, and I was miles from the nearest town or help. I debated trying to start my truck and make a run for it, but I was afraid the noise would alert them, and they'd be on me before I could get away. So I stayed frozen in place, hoping against hope that they'd leave soon. But to my horror, I saw them start walking towards my truck. They were moving slowly, cautiously, clearly trying to be quiet. One of them was carrying something. In the faint light, it looked like a crowbar or tire iron. My blood ran cold. These weren't just some random campers. They were here to rob me, or worse. Images of all the horrible things that could happen flashed through my mind. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. They were only about 10 feet away now. I could hear their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The one with the weapon raised it, ready to smash my window. I was about to scream or honk the horn, anything to try to scare them off, when suddenly a deafening crack split the night air. It took me a second to realize it was a gunshot. For a moment, everything was perfectly still and silent. Then all hell broke loose. The two men started yelling and scrambling back to their SUV. I heard doors slamming, an engine roaring to life, tires spinning in the dirt. Within seconds, they were gone, fishtailing down the road and disappearing into the darkness. I lay there in shock, my whole body shaking. What just happened? Where did that shot come from? Was I hit? It took several minutes for my racing thoughts to calm enough to process what had occurred. Slowly, carefully, I peeked out the window of my camper shell. The clearing was empty and silent once again. There was no sign of the men or their vehicle, and no sign of whoever had fired that shot. I strained my eyes, searching the tree line for any movement, but the forest was like a black wall of shadows. If someone was out there, I couldn't see them. Part of me wanted to call out, to thank my mysterious savior, but a bigger part was terrified of drawing attention to myself again. What if it wasn't someone trying to help me? What if there was something even worse out there in the woods? I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was impossible. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I was in the driver's seat and peeling out of there as fast as I could on the rough dirt road. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars and signs of civilization, that I finally started to relax. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. I kept replaying the events of the night in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Who were those men? What would have happened if that shot hadn't scared them off? And most of all, who fired it? The most likely explanation seemed to be another camper or hunter in the area who heard what was happening and intervened. But I never saw or heard anyone else out there. Part of me wants to believe it was some kind of guardian angel looking out for me. The logical side of my brain says that's ridiculous. But I can't shake the feeling that something truly inexplicable happened that night. I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office once I got to the next town. They took my statement but didn't seem very optimistic about catching the guys. Apparently that area has had problems with criminals targeting isolated campers before. They commended whoever fired the shot for likely saving my life. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about those men approaching my truck. I've done a lot of solo camping and travel in my life, but that experience shook me to my core. I realize now how vulnerable I made myself by going to such a remote area alone. I'm much more cautious these days. I stick to established campgrounds with other people around. I invested in some self-defense items to keep in my vehicle, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially at night. But I still love the outdoors and don't want to let fear keep me from enjoying nature. I just approach it with a lot more respect for the potential dangers now. And I'll never forget the night when an unseen stranger may have saved my life with a single shot in the darkness. I often wonder about that mysterious shooter. Was it really just a random camper who happened to be in the right place at the right time? Or was there something more to it? I'll probably never know for sure. But whoever you are out there, thank you. I owe you my life. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing some weird noises coming from upstairs. At first, I tried to ignore it. Our old house always made strange creaks and groans, especially at night. But this was different. It sounded almost like footsteps, soft and muffled, but definitely there. I muted the TV and held my breath, straining to listen. For a few moments there was nothing. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking around upstairs. My heart started racing. Jake wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday. Was someone in our house? I sat frozen on the couch, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Jake came home early and didn't tell me, but he always texted when his plans changed. Could it be a burglar? But how would they have gotten in? All the doors and windows were locked. Just as I was convincing myself it was all in my head, I heard the distinct creak of a door opening upstairs. That was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and the heaviest thing within reach, a thick, hardcover book. As I crept towards the stairs, I debated calling the police. But what would I even say? I hadn't actually seen anyone. Maybe there was a logical explanation. I needed to check it out first. Each step up the stairs felt like an eternity. The old wood creaked under my feet, and I winced at how loud it sounded in the silence. When I reached the landing, I paused, listening intently. The upstairs hallway was dark and still. "Hello," I called out weakly, immediately regretting it. What if someone really was up here? I flicked on the hallway light, my eyes darting around. Nothing seemed out of place. I slowly made my way down the hall, peering into each room. Jake's bedroom, empty. The bathroom, nothing. My bedroom was the last door on the left, and it was closed. I know I'd left it open earlier. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob and pushed it open. The room was exactly as I'd left it, but somehow different. The air felt heavy and charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, and it was freezing cold. I flipped on the light switch and did a quick scan of the room. The closet door was slightly ajar. Had I left it like that? I couldn't remember. I approached it cautiously, gripping my makeshift weapon tighter. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the closet door open. Empty. Just my clothes hanging there as usual. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly for getting so worked up. It was probably just my imagination running wild after watching too many horror movies. But as I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. The curtains by my window were swaying gently, but the window was closed, and there was no breeze. I backed out of the room quickly, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type as I pulled up Jake's number. "Hey man, did you come home early?" I texted, praying for a response. A minute ticked by, then 5. No reply. I didn't want to go back downstairs. Something about being in that open space with my back to the stairs made me feel incredibly vulnerable. But I couldn't stand here in the hallway all night either. I did another sweep of the upstairs, checking every possible hiding spot. Still nothing. By the time I convinced myself to go back downstairs, I was a nervous wreck. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every little noise made me jump. I turned on every light in the house and triple-checked all the locks. Then I settled back on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with all the lights blazing. There was no way I was sleeping tonight. As the hours crawled by, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the stairs, half expecting to see a figure standing there. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, right above me, slow and deliberate. My whole body went rigid with fear. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was up there. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, heading towards the stairs. I was paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. They were coming down. Oh God, they were coming down. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body trembling. I could hear them on the stairs now. Step, 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 getting closer, and then nothing. The silence was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, eyes closed, barely breathing. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the living room was empty. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every little sound. When the first rays of sunlight finally started peeking through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it through the night. With daylight came a sense of normalcy, and I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Maybe I'd dozed off and had an incredibly vivid nightmare. When Jake got home on Sunday, I casually asked if he'd stopped by the house at all. He looked at me like I was crazy. Dude, I was 6 hours away. Why would I drive all the way back without telling you? I played it off as a joke, but inside I felt cold. If it wasn't Jake, then what the hell happened that night? It's been months now, and nothing like that has ever happened again. Sometimes I wonder if I really did imagine the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, or hear an unexplained noise in the night, and that feeling of terror comes rushing back. I still live in that house, but I never feel quite alone anymore. And I always keep my bedroom door closed at night. When I arrived at the campsite on Friday afternoon, there were a few other groups there, mostly families with kids. I set up my tent a little ways away from the others, wanting some privacy. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by pine forests with mountains in the distance. As evening fell, I sat by my campfire, grilling some hot dogs and listening to the sounds of nature. It was so peaceful. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a hike. When I got back to the campsite around lunchtime, I noticed the other campers were packing up to leave. By mid-afternoon, I had the whole place to myself. At first, I was excited about the solitude. I decided to go for a swim in the lake to cool off. The water felt amazing after the hot hike. I floated on my back, staring up at the blue sky and fluffy white clouds. That's when I first got the feeling I was being watched. I can't explain it, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I looked towards the shore and thought I saw movement in the trees, like someone ducking behind a trunk. My heart started racing. I swam back to shore as quickly as I could, trying to act casual in case someone really was there. Back on dry land, I scanned the tree line but didn't see anyone. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to distract myself by gathering more firewood and starting dinner early. As I moved around my campsite, I kept glancing towards the forest. Once, I could have sworn I saw a man standing between two distant trees, just staring in my direction. But when I looked again, he was gone. By the time night fell, I was thoroughly creeped out. I considered packing up and leaving, but it was a long drive back to civilization, and I didn't want to navigate the dark, winding roads. I told myself I was overreacting and that I'd feel better after a good night's sleep. I climbed into my sleeping bag around 10 p.m., exhausted from the day's activities and stress. Despite my nerves, I managed to drift off pretty quickly. I'm not sure how long I was asleep before something woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the tent. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly pulled down. My blood ran cold. I lay there frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The zipper stopped about halfway down. Then I saw a hand push through the opening. In the faint moonlight filtering through the tent fabric, I could make out the silhouette of a man crouching there. He was reaching towards me. Pure terror coursed through my body. Without thinking, I grabbed the can of bear spray I kept next to my sleeping bag and let loose. The man let out a blood-curdling scream as the spray hit him full in the face. He fell backwards out of the tent, thrashing and yelling. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I burst out of the tent, not even bothering with shoes, and sprinted towards my car. I could hear the man still screaming and stumbling around behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I floored it out of there, spewing gravel everywhere. I drove like a maniac down the dark, twisting road, certain that at any moment I'd see headlights in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I finally felt safe enough to pull over and call 911. The police took my statement and sent some officers out to the campsite, but they didn't find anyone. All my camping gear was still there, apparently untouched. There were some footprints around my tent, but that was it. No other evidence of the intruder. It's been 2 months since that night, and I still have nightmares about it. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering who that man was and what he wanted. Was he some random psycho, a serial killer, or maybe some deranged homeless person living in the woods? I'll probably never know. The police couldn't find any similar reports in the area. They told me it was probably just a one-off incident, maybe a drunk camper who stumbled into the wrong tent. But that doesn't explain why I felt like I was being watched all day. And it certainly doesn't explain the terrifying intensity of that moment when I woke up to find him reaching for me in the dark. I used to love camping and being out in nature. Now, the thought of sleeping in a tent makes me break out in a cold sweat. I've canceled all my outdoor plans for the foreseeable future. My friends think I'm overreacting, that I should just go camping with a group next time. But they weren't there. They didn't see the silhouette of that man crouching in my tent, didn't feel the heart-stopping terror of waking up to a stranger reaching for you in the dark. I know I can't avoid the outdoors forever. Eventually, I'll probably work up the courage to go hiking or camping again. But I swear I will never, ever camp alone again. And I'll definitely be sleeping with one eye open and a can of bear spray within reach. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by running away. Should I have tried to subdue the guy, to find out who he was and what he wanted? But in that moment of sheer panic, all I could think about was getting away. Flight overtook fight, and I'm not sure I would react any differently if it happened again. The worst part is the not knowing who he was, what he wanted, or if he's still out there somewhere. Every time I see a man who vaguely matches the silhouette I saw that night, my heart starts racing. I find myself looking over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see him following me. I've thought about going back to that campsite, just to face my fears and prove to myself that it's just a normal place. But every time I consider it, I'm overwhelmed by a wave of panic. What if he's still there, waiting? What if he recognizes me and comes after me again? I know it's not rational. The chances of him still being there, or of him tracking me down, are incredibly slim. But fear isn't rational. It's a primal, instinctive thing that bypasses all logic and reason. I've started seeing a therapist to help me process the trauma. She says it's normal to feel this way after such a terrifying experience, that it will take time to heal. We're working on relaxation techniques and ways to manage my anxiety. It's helping, slowly but surely. One thing that's been particularly hard is explaining to my family and friends why I'm so shaken up. They're sympathetic, but I can tell they don't really get it. How can they? Unless you've experienced that kind of bone-deep terror, it's hard to understand how it can affect every aspect of your life. I find myself obsessively checking the locks on my doors and windows every night. I've installed a security system and motion-activated lights all around my house. Intellectually, I know he's not going to show up at my home in the city. But that doesn't stop the fear. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Could it have been a vivid nightmare? But then I remember the police report, the footprints they found, and I know it was real. Sometimes I almost wish it had been a dream. At least then I could wake up and shake it off. I've started researching self-defense classes. I never want to feel that helpless again. Maybe if I feel more capable of protecting myself, I'll be able to reclaim some of the confidence I've lost. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time. Some days are better than others. On good days, I can almost forget about it and go about my normal life. On bad days, every shadow seems menacing and every unexpected sound makes me jump. I hope that someday I'll be able to look back on this as just a scary story to tell around a campfire. But for now, it's all too real, too raw. The memory of that hand reaching for me in the darkness still haunts me. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe in the wilderness again. But I'm trying to heal, trying to move forward. It's a slow process, but I have to believe that eventually the fear will fade and I'll be able to enjoy the outdoors again. Until then, I'll stick to well-lit, populated areas and leave the solo camping to braver souls than me. It was a quiet Tuesday night, around 11:30 p.m. I was alone in the store, killing time before closing at midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I restocked the coolers, the only sound besides the occasional car whooshing by on the nearby highway. I heard the bell chime as the door opened. Glancing up, I saw a man enter wearing a dark coat, hood pulled low over his face. Something about him immediately put me on edge. He moved stiffly, almost robotically, and didn't acknowledge me at all as he began slowly pacing the aisles. "Can I help you find anything?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. He just kept wandering, occasionally picking up items only to set them back down. His movements seemed erratic and twitchy. As he made his way to the back of the store, I caught a glimpse of his face in one of the security mirrors. His eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around wildly. Dark circles stood out against his pale, sweaty skin. My heart started racing as I realized something was seriously off about this guy. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up, I'd catch him staring at me with this unnervingly blank expression. He'd quickly look away, pretending to browse the shelves, but I could feel his eyes boring into me whenever my back was turned. After about 10 minutes of this, I was really starting to freak out. My palms were sweaty and my mouth was dry. I kept glancing at the clock, silently willing it to hit midnight so I could lock up and get the hell out of there. Suddenly, the man was at the counter. I hadn't even seen him approach. He slammed a candy bar down, making me jump. Just this?" I stammered. He nodded curtly, still avoiding eye contact. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands shaking. That's when I saw it, the glint of metal peeking out from his coat sleeve. My blood ran cold as I realized he was concealing a knife. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I fumbled with the register, my fingers feeling numb and clumsy. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The man's breathing had become heavy and ragged. He started muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. Just as I was handing him his change, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron, fingernails digging into my skin. I looked up and found myself staring into his wild, manic eyes. A crazed grin spread across his face as he leaned in close. "I've been watching you, Leo," he hissed. My blood turned to ice. How did he know my name? Before I could react, the door chimed again. The man's head snapped towards the sound. Another customer had walked in, some guy grabbing a late-night snack. The newcomer gave us a strange look, clearly sensing the tension. In an instant, the man released my wrist and bolted for the door, knocking over a display in his haste. I stood there paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. The new customer asked if I was okay, saying I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I mumbled something about being fine and quickly rang him up. As soon as he left, I locked the doors and called the police with shaking hands. They came and took my statement, but said there wasn't much they could do without more to go on. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every little sound, convinced the man would come back. I kept replaying his words in my head. "I've been watching you." Had he been stalking me? How long had he been planning this? Even now, a week later, I'm still on edge. I've asked to be moved to day shifts, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every customer that comes in makes me tense up. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that manic grin lurking in the shadows. I don't know what would have happened if that other customer hadn't shown up when he did. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. All I know is that I came face to face with true evil that night, and I'll never be the same. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for another chance to strike. The police say they'll keep an eye out, but I know the reality is that they probably won't find him. I'm left feeling helpless and paranoid, jumping at every shadow. I've started seeing a therapist to try and process it all, but I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I keep going over every detail, trying to figure out if there were warning signs I missed. Had he been in the store before, scoping things out? Was he watching me from afar, learning my schedule and routines? The thought makes my skin crawl. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings now. Every person I pass on the street becomes a potential threat. I find myself studying faces, looking for that manic gleam in their eyes. It's exhausting living with this constant fear and suspicion. My coworkers have noticed the change in me. I used to be pretty laid back, always joking around. Now I'm tense and jumpy, snapping at the slightest provocation. I hate what this has done to me, how it's changed my whole personality. But I don't know how to go back to the carefree person I was before. I've thought about quitting my job, but I can't afford to be unemployed right now. And part of me worries that if I leave, I'll just be running away from the problem without actually solving anything. What if he follows me to my next job? So I'm stuck in this limbo, going through the motions of my daily life while constantly looking over my shoulder. Every customer interaction is tinged with fear and suspicion. I hate feeling this way, but I don't know how to make it stop. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe I dozed off at work and had some vivid nightmare. But then I look down at the fading bruises on my wrist where he grabbed me, and I know it was all too real. I've started carrying pepper spray with me everywhere I go. I know it's probably not enough to stop someone truly determined to hurt me, but it makes me feel a little less helpless. I've also been researching self-defense classes in my area. The worst part is the not knowing who he was or why he targeted me, not knowing if he'll come back or if he's moved on to stalking someone else. The uncertainty eats away at me, leaving me constantly on edge. I find myself analyzing every interaction now, wondering if seemingly innocent customers are secretly scoping out the store. Every time the door chimes, my heart races. I'm constantly watching the security cameras, searching for any sign of that dark coat and manic eyes. My friends and family have noticed the change in me. They keep asking what's wrong, but I don't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. How do you tell people that you're convinced a knife-wielding maniac is stalking you? So I put on a brave face and try to act normal. But inside, I'm constantly reliving that moment when he grabbed my wrist and whispered my name. The pure malice in his eyes haunts my dreams. I don't know how long I can keep living like this. The constant fear and hypervigilance is taking its toll, both mentally and physically. I'm not sleeping well. I've lost my appetite. I feel like I'm slowly unraveling. But what choice do I have? I can't live in fear forever, but I also can't pretend it never happened. All I can do is take it one day at a time and hope that eventually the fear will fade. That one day I'll be able to work a shift without constantly looking over my shoulder. For now, though, I'm left with more questions than answers. Who was he? Why did he choose me? Will he be back? The uncertainty is almost worse than the actual encounter. At least then I knew what I was dealing with. Now, the threat could come from anywhere, at any time. So I go through my days in a fog of anxiety and paranoia, jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected sound. Always wondering if today will be the day he comes back to finish what he started. Always searching for answers that may never come. I was just 13 when it happened. It's been years, but I still get chills thinking about that rainy afternoon and how close I came to being kidnapped right out of my own home. It was a typical gloomy day in October. School had let out early due to a big storm rolling in, so I was home alone while my parents were still at work. I remember sprawling out on the couch, flipping through channels and feeling bored as the rain pelted against the windows. Around 3 p.m., there was a loud, aggressive knock at the front door that made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone, and something about the forceful pounding immediately put me on edge. I crept over to peek through the peephole, and my heart started racing when I saw a man in what looked like a police uniform standing on the porch. He didn't look like any cop I'd ever seen, though. His uniform was rumpled and dirty, his hair was greasy and unkempt, and he had this wild, unsettling look in his eyes. Before I could even process what I was seeing, he started pounding on the door again. "Police! Open up!" he shouted in a slurred voice that didn't sound official at all. Every instinct told me something wasn't right. I backed away from the door, trying to stay quiet. My palms were sweating as I fumbled for my cell phone, ready to call my parents or 911. The man kept banging and yelling. "I know you're in there, kid. This is the police. You have to let me in right now." I was shaking, torn between my ingrained urge to obey authority and the overwhelming feeling that this guy was dangerous. I decided to try talking to him through the door without opening it. "What's this about, officer?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "My parents aren't home right now." "There's been a break-in reported in the neighborhood," he slurred back. "I need to come in and check that everything's secure. Open this door immediately." My mind was racing. I'd never heard of police doing random house checks like that, especially when no one was home. And why would they send just one cop who looked and sounded drunk? It didn't add up. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in when my parents aren't here," I said. "Can you please come back later when they're home?" That's when things got really scary. The man started rattling the doorknob violently, trying to force his way in. "Listen here, you little brat. Open this fucking door right now or I'll break it down." I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding out of my chest. This was definitely not a real cop. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, then sprinted upstairs to my parents' room, where I knew my dad kept a baseball bat. The whole time, I could hear the man downstairs alternating between pounding on the door and trying to sweet-talk me into opening it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to explain the situation as calmly as I could, but I was practically hyperventilating. The operator told me to stay on the line and that police were on their way. Those next few minutes felt like hours as I huddled in my parents' closet, clutching the phone and bat. Suddenly, there was a massive crash from downstairs. He'd broken through the front door. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs as the man shouted, "Where are you, you little shit? Come out wherever you are." I was paralyzed with fear, holding my breath and praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps got closer and closer. I could hear him throwing open doors, ransacking rooms. Just as the closet door started to open, there was a commotion downstairs, shouts of "Police! Freeze!" followed by what sounded like a scuffle. I stayed frozen in place until I heard a woman's voice call out, "Honey, are you up here? It's safe to come out now." Shaking and sobbing, I emerged to find a real police officer, a kind-faced woman who immediately wrapped me in a hug and assured me I was safe. As she led me downstairs, I saw two male officers handcuffing the fake cop who'd tried to break in. He was thrashing and cursing, foam practically coming out of his mouth as he glared at me with pure hatred. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements, being checked out by paramedics, and finally reuniting with my frantic parents. It wasn't until days later that we learned the full story from the detectives. The man who tried to break in was a convicted child predator who'd recently been released from prison. He'd been stalking our neighborhood for weeks, watching kids and looking for an opportunity. When he saw me come home alone that day, he decided to make his move by impersonating a cop. If I had opened that door, there's no doubt in my mind that he would have grabbed me, and I never would have been seen again. The police told us that my quick thinking in not letting him in and calling 911 right away probably saved my life. It's been years, but I still have nightmares sometimes about those terrifying moments hiding in the closet, hearing him searching for me. I'm jumpy around strangers in uniform and I triple-check the locks on my doors every night. But mostly, I'm just incredibly grateful that I trusted my instincts that day. It's a chilling reminder that danger can come from unexpected places, even people who are supposed to protect us. I hope sharing my story might help someone else stay safe if they ever find themselves in a similar situation. Always trust your gut. It could save your life. It was a typical Tuesday evening, and I was settling in for another late night at work. As a web developer for an online news outlet, I often got stuck with the night shift to handle any website emergencies or last-minute changes. Usually, I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me uninterrupted time to focus. But that night felt different from the moment I walked in. The office was on the 14th floor of a tall commercial building downtown. As I rode up in the elevator, I had this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. When the doors opened, I hesitated before stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting strange shadows. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. I made my way to my desk and booted up my computer, trying to ignore the eerie silence. Normally I'd put on some music, but for some reason I felt compelled to stay alert to my surroundings. As I worked on a minor website update, I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. Around 11 p.m., I finished up the project and decided to take a break. I got up to stretch my legs and grab a snack from the break room, As I walked down the hallway, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw a door slowly swing shut. But when I turned to look, it was closed and still. My heart started racing, but I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings settle, right? Air currents can move doors. I'm just letting my imagination run wild because it's late and I'm alone. I hurried to the break room, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. As I stood in front of the vending machine fumbling for change, I heard it. A soft thud, like footsteps coming from down the hall. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. But that was impossible. I was the only one here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence, then more footsteps getting closer. Panic rising in my chest, I abandoned my snack and quickly made my way back towards my desk. As I rounded the corner, I saw movement at the far end of the hallway. A dark figure, just for a split second, before it disappeared into one of the offices. "Hey!" I shouted, surprising myself with my bravado. "This is private property. You can't be in here." No response. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure what to do. Should I investigate? Call security? As I debated my options, I heard more noises, shuffling, creaking, like someone was moving around in the office. Against my better judgment, I inched closer to investigate. The door to the office was ajar. With a trembling hand, I pushed it open wider. "Hello?" I called again, peering into the darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with tremendous force, nearly taking off my fingers. I yelped and stumbled backwards, adrenaline coursing through my veins. That's when I saw her. At the end of the hallway stood a woman, but not a normal woman. This was something out of a nightmare. She had long, tangled black hair that seemed to move of its own accord. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, but it was her eyes that paralyzed me with fear, pitch black, empty, and fixed directly on me with a predatory intensity. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen in terror, as she slowly lifted one arm and pointed a bony finger at me. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. I could hear her behind me, not footsteps, but a horrible scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard. I slammed into the elevator doors, frantically pushing the button. Come on," I yelled. The scraping was getting closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. She was at the end of the hallway, crawling on all fours like some kind of inhuman spider, her head twisted at an impossible angle to keep those terrifying eyes locked on me. Just as she was about to reach me, the elevator dinged. I dove inside, mashing the lobby button and closed door buttons simultaneously. As the doors started to slide shut, I saw her lunge towards me, mouth open in a silent howl. The doors closed just in time, and I collapsed against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. The ride down to the lobby felt like an eternity. I kept expecting the elevator to stop, for those doors to open and reveal her waiting for me. But miraculously, I made it to the ground floor. I burst out of the elevator and ran straight out of the building, not stopping until I was several blocks away. Once I felt relatively safe, I called the police with trembling hands. They arrived quickly and did a thorough search of the building, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of any intruder, and certainly no ghastly woman. The security cameras didn't pick up anything either, other than me running out of the building like I was being chased by the devil himself. I know how it sounds. Trust me, I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I fell asleep at my desk and had a vivid nightmare. Maybe someone slipped something in my coffee and I hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The company took the incident seriously enough to hire a night security guard, which I appreciate, but it hasn't done much to ease my anxiety. I still work there, but I absolutely refuse to stay past sunset. Even during the day, I'm constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder. The rational part of my brain tells me it was a one-time thing, that whatever happened that night is over. But there's another part of me, a primal part, that knows she's still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can hear that faint scraping sound getting closer and closer. Story 26. It all started on what seemed like a normal Tuesday night. I'd been working at the warehouse for about a month, and things had been pretty quiet. Sure, there had been some break-ins before I started, which is why they hired extra security in the first place. But in my time there, the scariest thing I'd encountered was a raccoon that had somehow gotten inside. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. as usual. The day crew had already left, so it was just me and acres of dimly lit warehouse space. I did my first round of checks, making sure all the doors were locked and secure. Everything seemed normal at first. It wasn't until about 1 a.m. that things started to get weird. I was doing another walkthrough when I noticed something off about one of the side doors. It wasn't fully closed. There was a small gap, maybe half an inch wide. At first I figured it was just the wind or something, but when I went to close it properly, I realized there was actually a piece of wood wedged in there, keeping it from shutting. My heart started racing immediately. This was definitely not normal. Someone had deliberately propped this door open, and recently too. It hadn't been like that during my first round. I pulled out the wood and made sure the door latched securely, then radioed it in to my supervisor. He told me to stay alert and keep an eye out for anything else suspicious. For the next hour, I was on high alert. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every creak of the building settling sounded like footsteps. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around 2:30 a.m., I was patrolling near the loading docks when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure darted between two parked trucks just at the edge of my flashlight beam. It was only for a split second, but I'm certain of what I saw. A man, dressed all in black, moving with purpose. I called out, demanding they show themselves, but got no response. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my radio as I called for backup. I knew I should probably wait for help to arrive, but I was scared the intruder would get away if I didn't act fast. Keeping my distance, I made my way over to the security office where we had monitors showing feeds from all the cameras. I figured I could use those to track the guy's movements and direct the police when they arrived. As soon as I pulled up the camera feeds, I saw him. He was moving quickly through the rows of shelving, clearly searching for something specific. That's when I noticed the glint of metal in his hand. A knife, or maybe a small gun. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just some petty thief. This guy was armed and dangerous. I watched helplessly as he made his way deeper into the warehouse. Every few minutes he'd stop and consult something. A map, maybe? Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to know exactly where it was. Suddenly, he looked directly at one of the cameras. Even through the grainy black and white footage, I could sense the malice in his eyes. He raised his middle finger at the lens, then took off running towards the exit. By the time the police arrived 10 minutes later, he was long gone. They searched the surrounding fields, but found no trace of him. I gave my statement, showed them the camera footage, but ultimately they had very little to go on. The next few weeks were nerve-wracking. Security was beefed up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every night I'd come to work, wondering if this would be the night he came back to finish whatever he'd started. The police investigation went nowhere. They never identified the guy or figured out what he was after. Management tried to downplay the whole thing, saying it was probably just a one-off incident. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in that man's eyes. This wasn't over. After about a month, I couldn't take it anymore. The constant stress and fear were taking a toll on my mental health. I handed in my notice and found a new job at a quiet little office building. The pay wasn't as good, but at least I could sleep at night. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about that night sometimes. What was that guy really after? Why did he single out our warehouse? And most importantly, will he be back? I don't know if I'll ever get answers to those questions, but one thing's for sure. I'll never work another night shift as long as I live. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was just a random incident. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel those cold eyes watching me through my bedroom window. And I wonder, did I really escape that night? Or was it just the beginning of something much worse? Around 9:30 p.m., I decided to take my break and grab a quick snack from the food court. As I was walking past the darkened storefronts, I noticed something that made me pause. There was a man standing near one of the large glass windows overlooking the parking lot, just staring intently at the store I worked in. He was wearing a dark leather jacket and scuffed-up boots, and something about his stance sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and continued on my way, but I couldn't help glancing back over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved an inch. He was still fixated on our store with an unsettling intensity. My appetite suddenly gone, I decided to cut my break short and head back. As I approached the store entrance, my heart nearly stopped. The man had moved away from the window and was now walking purposefully in my direction, his eyes locked onto me. Panic rising in my throat, I fumbled for my keys and practically ran the last few steps to the door. I could hear his footsteps quickening behind me as I frantically tried to get the key in the lock with shaking hands. Just as I managed to wrench the door open, I felt his presence right behind me. Without looking back, I dove inside and slammed the door shut, hearing it click locked just as a hand slapped against the glass. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the door, me wide-eyed and panting, him with an expression I can only describe as hungry. Then he slowly backed away and melted into the shadows. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled to the back room, my mind racing. Should I call security? The police? Was I overreacting? I decided to text my coworker Chris, who was supposed to be restocking in the storage area, to see if he'd noticed anything weird, but he didn't respond. I was debating what to do next when suddenly the emergency alarm started blaring from the storage area. My blood ran cold as I realized Chris must be in trouble. Fighting every instinct screaming at me to run, I grabbed a heavy metal hanger for protection and crept towards the storage room. The storage area was dim and cluttered with boxes and racks of clothing. "Chris?" I called out shakily. "Are you okay?" No response. As I rounded a corner, I saw a flicker of movement and nearly screamed, but it was just Chris, wide-eyed and trembling, emerging from behind a clothing rack. "He was in here," Chris whispered, his voice hoarse. "That guy in the leather jacket. He chased me. I barely got away and hit the alarm." My mind was reeling. How had the man gotten in? Where was he now? We huddled together, straining to hear any sound of movement over the blaring alarm. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the distant wail of police sirens approaching. The next hour passed in a blur as police swept the store and mall. They found a back door that had been forced open, but no sign of the intruder. Chris and I gave our statements, our voices shaky as we recounted what happened. The officers were sympathetic, but seemed skeptical that it was anything more than a failed robbery attempt. As things were winding down, one of the officers pulled out a blurry security camera image. "Is this the man you saw?" he asked. My stomach dropped as I recognized the leather jacket and menacing posture. Chris nodded vigorously beside me. "We'll circulate this to the other stores and increase patrols," the officer assured us. "But for now, it seems he's long gone." Somehow those words didn't make me feel any better. As I drove home that night, jumping at every shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That hungry look in the man's eyes kept flashing in my mind. What did he want? Why us? It's been a few weeks now, and nothing else has happened. But I still get chills every time I see someone in a leather jacket. I've started looking for a new job, somewhere far from that mall. Because deep down, I can't shake the fear that one night I'll look up from the cash register and see that face pressed against the store window again, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe at work again. The police never found the guy, and sometimes I wonder if I imagined how sinister he seemed. But then I remember the terror in Chris's eyes, and I know it was real. I just hope I never have to experience anything like that again. Every noise makes me jump now when I'm closing up the store. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that leather jacket in my peripheral vision. My coworkers think I'm being paranoid, but they weren't there that night. They didn't see the cold determination in that man's eyes. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a desperate guy looking to rob the place. But why fixate on our store specifically? Why chase Chris through the back? Something about it just felt more personal, more malevolent. The worst part is the not knowing. Not knowing who he was, what he wanted, if he'll come back. Every customer that walks in, I find myself studying their face, their clothes, looking for any hint of recognition. It's exhausting being on high alert all the time. I've started seeing a therapist to deal with the anxiety and nightmares. She says it's a normal reaction to trauma, that it will get better with time. But she also gently suggested I consider finding a new job, one that doesn't trigger these fears. I'm seriously considering it. My boss has been understanding, letting me switch to day shifts and always scheduling at least one other person to close with me. But it's not enough to make me feel secure. The memory of that night is burned into my brain, the pounding footsteps behind me, the slap of his hand on the glass, Chris's terrified face in the storage room. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been a few seconds slower getting that door open, or if Chris hadn't managed to hit the alarm. The what-ifs keep me up at night. I know I need to move on, to not let this experience define me. But it's hard when every leather jacket, every scuffed boot, every lingering glance from a customer sends my heart racing. I'm trying to take it one day at a time, to focus on the positives in my life. But I don't think I'll ever forget that night, or shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that man is still watching and waiting. For now, all I can do is stay vigilant, trust my instincts, and hope that time will dull the sharp edges of this memory. But a part of me will always be that terrified girl, fumbling with her keys as footsteps draw ever closer in the empty mall. At first I thought it was just the wind or a tree branch scraping against the house. But then I heard it again, a faint scratching sound coming from the direction of the front door. My heart started racing. I lived alone, and I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late on a stormy night. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was nothing, but something in my gut told me to check it out. I crept towards the front of the house, straining my ears. As I got closer to the entryway, I could hear it more clearly, a metallic scraping noise, like someone was trying to jimmy the lock. My hands were shaking as I peered through the peephole. At first I didn't see anything in the darkness outside, but then a flash of lightning illuminated a face right on the other side of the door, pale, gaunt, with long, stringy hair plastered to his head from the rain, and his eyes. They were sunken and wild-looking, staring right at me through the peephole. I jerked back, my heart pounding out of my chest. This couldn't be happening. I fumbled for my phone to call 911, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely dial. As I was trying to make the call, I heard a loud crack from the front door. Panic overtook me. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. I could hear heavy footsteps in the entryway now. Oh God, he was inside. I was trapped. My mind was racing. Should I try to make a run for it? Hide? Fight? I ended up ducking behind the kitchen island, knife clutched in my sweaty hand. I was shaking uncontrollably, struggling to breathe quietly. The footsteps were getting closer, slow, methodical, like he was in no hurry, like he knew I was here and was savoring the hunt. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was all just a nightmare I'd wake up from. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I didn't dare move a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a creak from the living room. Was he in there now? What was he doing? I don't know how long I crouched there in terror, straining my ears for any sound. Eventually, I summoned the courage to peek around the island. The entryway and kitchen were empty. Had he left? I slowly stood up on shaky legs, still gripping the knife. I inched towards the living room, heart pounding. As I entered, at first I didn't see anyone, but then movement caught my eye. There was someone crouched behind my couch. I froze, unable to breathe. The intruder slowly rose up from behind the couch. In the dim light I could make out his tangled hair, his hollow eyes, and in his hand was a hammer, gripped tightly. We stared at each other for a long moment. I opened my mouth to say something, to plead, to scream, I don't know. But before I could make a sound, police sirens cut through the night. Blue and red lights started flashing through the windows. The intruder's head snapped towards the sound. In that moment of distraction, I bolted for the front door. I yanked it open and ran out into the rain, screaming for help. Everything after that is a blur. The police swarmed in. They found the guy still hiding in my living room. Turns out a neighbor had seen him breaking in and called 911. They took him away in handcuffs. I learned later he was a homeless man with a history of mental illness and drug abuse. He'd been breaking into houses in the area. I gave my statement to the police, but I was in shock. All I could think about was how long he'd been in my house, watching me. What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did? I couldn't stay in that house after that. I moved out the very next day, crashing on a friend's couch until I found a new place. But even in a new home, I couldn't shake the fear. For months, every little noise made me jump. I installed so many locks and security cameras that my friends started joking that my apartment was like Fort Knox. It's been over a year now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I see those sunken eyes staring at me in the dark. I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining someone hiding behind my furniture, waiting. The rational part of my brain knows I'm safe now. The guy is locked up, and I've got a top-notch security system. but there's a part of me that will never feel truly secure again, because now I know the truth, that sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows are all too real. I often wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently that night, if my neighbor hadn't seen him break in, if the police had arrived just a few minutes later. I imagine all the horrible things he could have done to me with that hammer. Sometimes I find myself obsessing over the details, replaying every moment in my head. Why did he choose my house? How long had he been watching me before he broke in? What was he planning to do? I've tried therapy, meditation, even medication to help with the anxiety and PTSD. It's gotten better over time, but I don't think I'll ever be the same person I was before that night. There's a constant undercurrent of fear that I just can't shake. I've become hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. I'm always scanning for potential threats, mapping out escape routes wherever I go. I can't relax in public spaces. Crowded areas make me panicky. I've lost friends because I rarely go out anymore. The hardest part is feeling like no one really understands what I went through. Unless you've experienced something like that, you can't truly comprehend the terror, the utter helplessness, the way it shakes you to your core and makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety and security. I know I should be grateful that nothing worse happened, that I wasn't physically harmed, but the psychological scars run deep. That night fundamentally changed how I see the world. It's like a veil was lifted, and now I'm acutely aware of how fragile our sense of safety really is. Sometimes I catch myself staring at strangers, wondering if they're hiding dark secrets or violent impulses. Every person on the street becomes a potential threat. It's exhausting to live with that level of constant suspicion and fear. I've tried to find meaning in what happened, to see it as a wake-up call or a chance for personal growth. But mostly, I just feel angry. Angry that my sense of peace was stolen from me. Angry that I have to live with this fear every day. There are times when I think I'm finally moving past it, when I can go a whole day without thinking about that night. But then something will trigger me, a loud noise, an unexpected knock at the door, and suddenly I'm right back there, paralyzed with fear as I hear those footsteps getting closer. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened, if I'll ever feel truly safe again. All I can do is take it one day at a time and hope that eventually the fear will fade. But deep down, I know I'll always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the monsters to emerge from the shadows once more. It was a typical Friday evening, and I was out making deliveries for Uber Eats and DoorDash. The orders had been steady, and I was grateful for the extra income. Around 10 p.m., I got a ping for a delivery to an area I wasn't too familiar with, somewhere on the outskirts of the city. The payout was decent, so I accepted it without much thought. As I drove towards the destination, I noticed the neighborhoods getting more run down. Abandoned buildings and dimly lit streets made me feel uneasy, but I brushed it off. I've delivered to sketchy areas before, and it's usually fine if you're careful. About halfway there, I got an eerie feeling that I was being followed. In my rearview mirror, I kept seeing the same car a few lengths behind me, matching my every turn. My heart started racing, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter and checking my mirrors more frequently. Finally, I arrived at the address, a dilapidated apartment complex that looked like it should have been condemned years ago. Most of the windows were boarded up, and there was graffiti everywhere. As I parked and got out with the food, that car that had been following me pulled up nearby. 3 men got out and started walking towards me. Everything in me screamed to get back in my car and drive away. but before I could react, they surrounded me. One of them spoke in a low, threatening voice. "You're gonna come with us nice and quiet. Don't try anything stupid." I was frozen in terror as they grabbed me and forced me towards the building. I wanted to yell for help, but my voice was stuck in my throat. They marched me up to a third-floor apartment and shoved me inside, locking the door behind us. The apartment was completely empty, except for some ratty furniture and trash strewn about. The windows were covered with thick blankets, blocking any view of the outside. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was another guy huddled in the corner, looking absolutely terrified. One of the men growled at me to sit down and shut up. They started arguing amongst themselves in hushed tones. I caught snippets about waiting for the buyer and getting a good price for two of them. With horror, I realized they were planning to sell us. For what exactly, I didn't want to imagine. The other captive guy and I exchanged panicked looks. He mouthed, "Help me," and I nodded, trying to convey that I was just as trapped as he was. I learned later his name was Mike, and he was also a delivery driver who had been lured here and captured earlier that day. For what felt like hours, we sat there in terrified silence while our captors paced around and made phone calls. I kept racking my brain for some way to escape, but they had taken our phones, and I knew we were outnumbered and overpowered. Just when I was starting to lose all hope, we heard sirens in the distance. Our captors started freaking out, yelling at each other about what to do. The sirens got closer and closer until they were right outside the building. Suddenly, there was loud banging on the apartment door and shouts of, "Police, open up!" Our captors panicked and tried to run, but within moments the door was broken down and officers swarmed in with guns drawn. In the chaos, Mike and I were rescued and our captors were arrested. It turned out a neighbor had heard suspicious noises and called 911. I've never been so relieved to see police in my life. As they led us out of that nightmare apartment, I broke down sobbing, the full weight of what had almost happened hitting me all at once. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements to detectives and being checked out by paramedics. They told us we were lucky, that human trafficking rings often use delivery drivers as easy targets. If that neighbor hadn't called when they did, who knows what would have happened to us. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about it. I can't bring myself to do delivery work anymore. Just the thought of it sends me into a panic attack. I'm in therapy now, trying to work through the trauma and anxiety. I'm sharing this as a warning to other delivery drivers out there. Trust your instincts if something feels off about an order. Don't go to unfamiliar areas alone, especially at night. And always let someone know where you're going. I'm one of the lucky ones who made it out, but that night will haunt me forever. Be safe out there. And remember that no amount of money is worth risking your life or freedom. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm just thankful I'm here to tell my story. That's when I first heard it, a faint cry coming from outside. I paused, cocking my head to listen. There it was again, louder this time. "Help! Somebody help me!" My heart started racing. Was someone in trouble? Should I call 911? I took off my headphones and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness of my backyard. At first I didn't see anything. Then a shadow moved near the fence. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. "Is someone there?" "Help me!" the voice cried again. "Please, I need help." Something felt off. If this person really needed urgent assistance, why were they just standing there yelling instead of coming to knock on my door? And how did they even get into my fenced backyard in the first place? I hesitated, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to go outside and see if I could help, but a stronger instinct told me to stay put. I decided to keep an eye on the situation from inside while I finished up with my current support call. For the next 20 minutes, the cries for help continued sporadically, always from the same spot near the back fence. My unease grew with each passing minute. This didn't seem like normal behavior for someone in distress. Finally, I wrapped up my call and turned my full attention to the situation outside. Creeping closer to the window, I squinted into the darkness. That's when I saw him. A man was standing perfectly still about 15 feet from my back door. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, his face obscured in shadow. His posture was unnaturally rigid and upright. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was staring directly at my window. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond or move a muscle. He just kept staring, stock still, in that unnatural pose. Thoroughly creeped out now, I backed away from the window and fumbled for my phone. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That there was a creepy statue man in my yard? Before I could decide, a loud bang made me jump out of my skin. Someone was pounding on my back door. "Let me in," a voice growled. "I know you're in there. Let me in now." I scrambled away from the door in panic, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The banging continued, growing more frantic and aggressive. "Open the fucking door," the voice roared. With trembling hands, I managed to dial 911. Please help," I stammered when the operator answered. "There's someone trying to break into my house." "Stay calm, sir. We're sending officers to your location now. Are you in a safe place?" I think so," I whispered. "I'm upstairs, but he's still banging on the door." "Okay, stay where you are and don't engage with the intruder. Officers should be there in about 5 minutes." Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. The pounding on the door had stopped, but I could hear footsteps circling the house. Occasionally a shadow would pass by a window. I cowered in the corner of my bedroom, terrified to make a sound. Finally, mercifully, I heard sirens in the distance. As they grew closer, I saw the hooded figure sprint across the yard and vault over the back fence. I sagged with relief, thinking it was over. But as I watched the police car pull up, movement near the fence caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I realized there were multiple dark shapes lurking just on the other side. 4 figures shifting in the shadows. This wasn't just some random creep. It was an organized group, and I had nearly fallen for their trap. I ran downstairs to let the officers in, babbling out my story in a panicked rush. They did a thorough search of the property, but found no sign of the intruders. One of the cops gently suggested that maybe I had dozed off at my desk and had a vivid nightmare. But I know what I saw. Those shapes in the shadows were real. Sometimes I still see them when I close my eyes at night. I don't work the night shift anymore.